Hello, chat. I think that I'm live. Allow me to wait for a second to make sure that I'm not hearing myself in my own ears. No, I think we're good. I think we're good. Yes, we're actually good. Lovely. Hello, Magdalena's Rex. Nice to see you. Good evening, everyone. I am really tired tonight because, oh my, I have had a long day. It has been a very nice week. Well, I won't say week. It's been a good 7 days because for the last 4 or 5 days, it has actually been good weather, would you believe? I have actually had good, pleasant, enjoyable weather, and I can get outside. I can touch grass, and more importantly, I can uproot the grass because it's growing in all the wrong places. Hello, Zule. No, Proctor, those are just the other voices in your head screaming at you. I have learned to ignore those a long time ago, okay? That's what the medication is for. Or rather it was, and I haven't been able to get it, and it hasn't been a good time, okay? It hasn't been a good time. No, actually, it's been a pretty decent time. The Shirt Lad Archive. Hello, Proctor. First time catching a stream live. Mostly been catching VODs. That's cool. I'm glad you could make it. That's one of the reasons why I decided to start streaming a little bit earlier than normal. Another being the fact that since I go to a college on... Well, it's technically not a college. I'm not even sure what to call it. Some kind of adult education program. It's like really ad hoc and stuff, but it is very good. Yeah, I have to catch a bus into a college at like 8 o'clock tomorrow, so yeah, I'm not going to be streaming particularly late any longer for the foreseeable future. Although I have managed to fix my sleep schedule, and I am making a serious effort to not allow myself to stay up for hours and hours and hours into the night, because it really was having a negative effect on me. Overall, my health has been vastly better for the past couple of months. I'm lifting extremely well. I haven't been doing too much lifting recently, though, because I've been gardening for like every hour that has been decent weather. And yeah, it turns out that when you shift like 12 barrel loads worth of garden waste up a hill every day, that counts as quite a lot of exercise, quite a lot of lifting. So yeah, my actual weights have been somewhat less of use recently. They mostly get broken out on rainy days now. But yeah, I'm feeling really good at the moment, which has been really nice. Also, Magdalena's Rex, you said, also, let me just put on live chat. Here we go. This works in time as background while working. If it happened at old time, it would happen when I'm dealing with partial differential equations. Also, Lent has started not going all in, but rip meat. I'm completely the opposite, because I have been meat maxing to the extreme recently, because it is a very good source of protein, which I very much enjoy. I've always been a filthy carny. I have always devoured meat as much as possible, which is kind of quite amusing considering that the main person who cooks in the house is nearly vegetarian, but she at least understands the value of a good steak and knows how to do rather good bacon, which is very pleasant. Anyway, let me get my stuff going. I'll probably yap for another 5 to 10 minutes or so, and then we will get into the review section. I am currently looking at my hands and looking at the pieces that are hanging off my hands, because do you guys know what pampas grass is? It's like a really tall, exotic grass from, I believe it's originally from Africa. And it can grow to like 20 feet tall. Ow. Ow, ow, ow. Don't do that. Ow. And it is just like a giant grass. But the thing is that the strands of it are very, very sharp. And they are... When you have pampas grass that has not been pruned for something like 3 or 4 years, it tends to grow an awful lot of it tends to have a vast amount of dead shoots and dead leaves that need to be removed. Now, the problem is that when pampas grass dies, it turns into like this very stiff, rigid material, which is still very sharp. And so as you're trying to grip it and pull it out or snip it, hello Ducato by the way, it has a tendency to slice along your fingers really badly. And gloves only partially work. I was wearing gloves, and all the gloves really do is kind of turn the cuts into calluses along the insides of your fingers. I would dox my hand at the moment, but yeah, it looks as if I've just been in a fight with a rather angry cat, and I have two rather large sticking plasters on my fingers because I was using secateurs. And for some reason, I managed to nearly prune the tips of my fingers twice in a row today, which was not a pleasant experience in any way at all. Fortunately, it didn't bleed very much, but yeah. I have two holes in my hand, in my left hand, where previously I did not have holes in my hand, and it was not a pleasant experience. Pan, good evening / afternoon / morning, Proctor. I live in Ireland, so it is currently evening for me. It's 7:30 GMT where I live, and yeah, it's 7:37. And I have a very nice coffee in front of me, which is very pleasant. I like my coffee quite strong, but with milk and sugar, and I also add a little bit of evaporated milk, which probably nobody in the chat is old enough to remember evaporated milk from when it first came out, but I find it rather amusing because I like evaporated milk, but both my parents, who were like in their 60s and 70s, they hate evaporated milk because they remember when evaporated milk was the only form of sweetener that was available commercially on average, and everybody used to use it. And the thing is about raw evaporated milk is it's evaporated because how to make evaporated milk is you take regular milk and you heat it up to a high temperature, and it causes the water content to decrease because that's what evaporates. And so evaporated milk on its own has a kind of slightly burnt taste to it, but I found that goes away entirely if you mix it into coffee, which is great. But yeah, both my parents remember when it was used almost exclusively as like a sweetener instead of sugar, because it is far sweeter than regular milk. And so yeah, they really hate it. They really find it a massive like reminder of the abject poverty of like 1960s and 70s era Britain. Whereas I'm just like, hey, this is a really nice sweetener to have with my coffee. It's like all the regular, it's much better than regular cream, because regular cream, if you buy it, it goes off very quickly. And I really hate when you get a bottle of cream and the top of it starts to go off before the bottom bit, and you get like these hardened layers of like sour cream around the edges of the cream bottle, which is really unpleasant. And the only option is like to go with the really chemically pressurized cream that you get in like cans, which doesn't go off in the same way, but that just has the nasty kind of aerosolized taste. So yeah, it's not a good choice, not a good choice at all. And so I find evaporated milk is very nice for my particular needs and desires. Only 1960s, so the UK has gotten worse then. Oh my god, the UK these days. I have to go back there to attend V-Expo. I don't want to. I really don't want to. I don't even want to visit England at the moment. I hate England. Just absolutely despise England. I don't understand why anybody in the UK is... even if you're like a hardcore liberal and you look at the situation in England at the moment, would you be happy? Magdalena Rex, don't you love its diversity? Don't you know diversity is its strength? Excuse me while I throw up my coffee, sorry. It's just disgusting to me, absolutely disgusting how much nonsense and insanity is going on in Britain, and I am just so intensely grateful that I live in Ireland, where it's still, it's still not good. It's still not good, trust me. Ireland is slowly getting as bad as England, little bit by little bit, but it's still a lot it's still a lot better. It's still far, far better. Don't you want your custom Turkish barber experience? Ugh, I have never been to a Turkish, don't you know? A Turkish barber in my entire life, and I have no intention of going. I don't even go to the hairdresser or anything. I just have my mother do my hair. My mother cuts my hair, and it saves me about €20. The price of a decent haircut at the moment is minimum €20 if you include like a €3 or €4 tip. I remember when you could get a decent haircut for under €10 plus a tip, and it's just absolutely crazy. Like, when my mother dies, I am going to learn how to cut my own hair, because there is no way I'm paying that much money for a flipping haircut when all I want is just shorten it out, just short back and sides. Thank you very much. And the funny thing is, my mother actually does a better job than the hairdresser, because you go to a hairdresser and you're like, oh, I want this style and I want that style, and can you put a bit of gel in it, and can you do that to it, and can you make it look like an angry cockatiel? And I'm just like, mate, I want to walk out of here with less hair than I walked in. I don't particularly care what else you do. And so they just kind of massacre my head each time, whereas my mother actually knows what makes me look decent, which is always a nice thing to happen. The ShirtNet archive, I remember cheap haircuts. Bro, I remember when the average ice cream cost about 50 cents. I remember when I was a child, when I was like 6 or 7 years old, and we went to the corner store just outside our the elementary school that I briefly attended, and you could get an ice cream for 40 cents. Oh dear. That was before the euro. And now you can't get anything. Like, the average ice cream costs about €2 minimum. More like I think the local, one of the local shopping places sells ice creams for an average of €2.75. And in a garage, you're looking at about €3 for the average ice cream. I am so glad that I have some form of, well, I'm not technically employed, but I do get money for what I do, so I suppose you could call that employment. So I am very grateful to have my gardening job at the moment, where I can just go out, I can do whatever I want, and then I can charge at the end of the day. I get it paid in cash, so I don't have to go through the government or the banks or anything like that. I can stick it in a box under my desk and I can forget about it, because I hate banks so deeply and so passionately. If I could just cash out everything and keep it at home and not have to deal with online banking in any capacity ever again, I would most likely go that route. I hate having to do any kind of digital financing in any way at all. It very much depresses and irritates me. But, of course, it's the way of the world now, and I wouldn't even have a mobile phone if I didn't have to use it for online banking. I hate mobile phones. The smallest device that I regularly use is my Lenovo tablet, which costs like €100, but it's very good. It plays audiobooks. It looks up the internet, and that's all I want it to do. I don't want tracking. I don't want location. I don't want anything else. I don't want to use a mobile phone. I actually physically despise having people be able to call me on whenever they want, because to me, contacting somebody else, approaching somebody else, should be an experience that you do when you actually want to do something with them, whereas mobile phones make everything so easy to just like text to keep in contact with people that as a result, I feel that communication becomes extremely cheap when you can just pick up the phone and call anyone at any time, whereas I almost borderline refuse to even touch my phone unless somebody has told me in advance they are going to call me. It's not quite as bad with emails, but I hate whenever my mobile phone rings for any reason. I'm just like, oh God, what now? Why? Who would be calling me? Why are you calling me? I don't want you to call me. And I'll always let it ring at minimum of like 3 or 4 rings until it's almost to the point where it times out. And only then will I answer my phone, because my attitude is, you are intruding on me. You are taking advantage of the fact that I am physically forced by circumstances to use this device. And so I am going to make sure that you understand that your ability to contact me at any time should not be taken for granted. I am going to exercise my autonomy in order to make your life just a tiny bit harder, just to remind you that you don't tell me what to do, that I am picking up your call on sufferance, okay? Now, maybe that's a little bit Luddite of me. Maybe I'm just a tiny bit petty for doing that, but it is... It is very much how I feel and how I prefer things to be. I hate mobile phones. Let me have a drink. Pan, how is Ireland? I want to visit it at some point since my grandparents are from there. Ireland in general, I would strongly recommend staying away from Dublin, and I would strongly recommend staying away from Limerick. The smaller cities are the better cities. I would say that small towns in Ireland are generally the best places to be. Unfortunately, they have been invaded quite a lot by migrants. Like the town that I go to for college, whole busloads of African faces pass by on a regular basis, and it's like a town of maybe 5,000 or 6,000 people, and it's a very rural, pretty remote town. And it is just so many migrants there. It's really upsetting. I mean, in fairness, they do seem to be the genuinely fairly nice kind, where they're pretty nice and respectful, and they seem to be quite polite. They're not like rampant gangs of youths who speak no English whatsoever. Not quite as bad as it is in quite a lot of places, but it's still very much obvious how few actual Irish faces and Irish accents you can hear even in a place like that. I would say the further west you go, the better things get. The further east you go, the more you get like England, but a little bit smaller, basically. I am in the Republic of Ireland. The north of Ireland is very poor and very depressing. Again, more rural locations are better. I've never been to the north, but stay away from the cities, because, goodness me, the cities are still segregated all of this time. There's still that nasty tension in the air lingering from the last time they decided to blow each other all up. But small towns in general in Ireland tend to be quite nice, and again, the further west you go, the better things are. The Galway area is a very well-known tourist spot that I have been on several occasions. Galway is a very lovely city. It's a really nice location. It is very touristy, but it's touristy in a pretty sophisticated kind of way. There are some absolutely gorgeous restaurants. There are some pretty decent like tourist locations. I think there's a place called the Cliffs of Moher. It's cliffs. It is definitely cliffs. And it's a very nice location. I've been there a couple of times. It's beautiful. I bought some of the best booze I've ever had in my life from the gift shop there. And yeah, there's some amazing restaurants in Galway. It's a very nice place. Cork is also a very nice city. It has the English market, which sells a great deal of very high-end cuisine and exotic cuisine for very decent prices. Let me see, is there anywhere else really? I mean, not that I've necessarily visited myself, but like Galway and Cork are definitely the two bigger cities that I would strongly recommend visiting. Cork also has some very nice art galleries, which I frequent, which are extremely good, and they're free to go into as well. I think most of them are free, except when there's like major exhibitions on. I think some of those are paid. But yeah, Cork is a lovely city, probably one of my favorite in Ireland. And that and Galway, both of those are great. North, stay away from it, basically. And also, avoid the beaches at night in the summer, because you might stumble across drug dealers. Northern Ireland especially is the gateway for Britain for pretty much all of its cocaine smuggling and heroin smuggling as well. Kenneth Patterson, are you going to watch the Rabbits Ireland stream? I might do so. That could be quite entertaining. But yeah, that's something that we've in fact had to deal with a few times. I'm almost certain that our local beach has been used for cocaine smuggling at least once or twice. There have been a lot of mysterious lights and unmarked vehicles, and followed a few hours later by like police drive-bys. So yeah, that's been fun. That's been very, very fun, but it's never close enough to actually affect us. And like, if it's a case of if you leave them alone, they'll leave you alone. And I have no problem with that. Have you been to Shannon? I'm afraid not. Where is Shannon even? I completely forget. Images. Shannon, County Clare. Now that's on the far east side of Ireland. It's another pretty well-known place, I know that much, but I have not been there myself. I've only really been to Galway. I like how I'm just looking on a map right now, and there's a town in like far eastern Ireland which is just called Letterfack. Letterfack. Random Irish names are always the funniest things. There's so many of them that are just completely. I like how there's an island that's just off the east coast of Ireland called Inishbofin. Inishbofin, Ireland. That is highly entertaining to me. And then there's one, goodness me, how do I even pronounce this? Snalia? Gween Snalia, I think. And then, oh my goodness, right below it is Talanagunduff? Yeah, Celtic and Irish is now hear me out, Proctor. Those aren't Snuggler's alien. What? I'm afraid I think you will have to rephrase that, because I do not understand what you were attempting to convey to me. But anyway, it's now been it's been 24 minutes, so I apologize. I meant to switch to my actual thing that I was going to do, but obviously I rambled about Ireland for a little bit too long. Allow me to just have another sip of my coffee, and then we will start to get into things. Allow me to switch to studio mode for a second so that I can make sure that the other system is set up properly, and yes, it is. For those that have not viewed this stream before, for some reason or other, what I'm currently doing is reviewing a book chapter by chapter. And the current book that I'm looking through, well, the first book for this series actually, is Evil, Inside Violence and Cruelty by Roy F. Baumeister, who is a very, very good writer, as I've come to see. Kenneth Patterson, I think he means they're vibrant asylum seekers and future doctors and engineers. No, this was long before the whole asylum thing kicked off. I'm talking like 5 or 6 years ago since that kind of thing happened. Actually, more than that, more like 10 years, actually, now that I think about it. So it almost certainly was not asylum seekers. It was definitely smugglers, that kind of thing. I mean, we would have known because at that time, refugees were so unknown in Ireland. If you saw a black face in town, every single person would turn their head. Like, the Irish were the most passively racist people you've ever known, because they just, something like the black population of Ireland before 5 years ago was something like 0.01%. It was the most ethnically white country in all of Europe, and if a black person came through the town, every single person would see it. John Doe is Proctor's model based on a pheasant. Yes, it is. Because I have a very, very pretty and dramatic-looking pheasant who I love, but he despises me, and he tries to viciously savage me at every opportunity he gets. I'm not meaning Indians. Pretty sure Ireland has a famous abduction story. Possibly. Let me just switch off studio mode. Yes. So anyway, we are on chapter 2 of this fine book, which you can see on the screen right now. And chapter 2 is all about victims and perpetrators. And allow me to pull up my notes here, because this is not like a dramatic reading or anything. I am not actually going to be reading the text on the screen. It would help if I actually scroll to the top of my notes instead of right at the bottom. Instead, I am basically showing the text on the screen, but I am summarizing the text on the screen, and I am presenting my own thoughts, intermixed with just general shortenings, shortened versions, or summations of the information that is contained within the chapter. I have used highlighting so that it is easy to quickly understand the kind of things that I'm getting up to. You can also see the page number on the top middle of the screen, which will allow you to understand what I'm currently referencing. So, and I do apologize if I ever stumble over anything, but the reality is I only have 2 screens. On one screen is my OBS, on the other is my notes. So it can sometimes be a little bit awkward to kind of tab between things. In fact, no, I can't do that because that just messes up the screen entirely. Whoops. I should not have done that. My apologies. Let me scroll back in again. There we go. I fixed everything. Yes, this is the first. As time goes on, I've already asked somebody if they can create like a couple extra assets that I can use for this kind of stream, and hopefully things will get a bit more professional as time goes on. I enjoy this kind of content. It takes a lot of research, but it's something that I decided that I would do because, yeah, I don't want to do VTuber drama at the moment. I really don't. My goodness. But anyway, let us actually get into things. Now, chapter 2 begins with a problem, and that problem is that evil can be approached in 2 completely contradictory ways. Now, the first way is to try and understand the popular image of evil, while the other seeks to understand the behavioral patterns that are stereotypically depicted as evil. That makes chapter 2 a chapter about the different perspectives of victims and victimizers, and the particular focus will be on the limitations of the former's view of events. Without such an understanding, any objective look at the process and methodology of evil will fail. And we begin our analysis with everyone's favorite group, which I commented on Twitter, and that is the Nazis. Yes, because when you want to talk about evil in any form of media, what's your go-to reference? It's gonna be the Nazis, our wonderful jackbooted friends from Germany, who are in no way at all worse than the Germans that we have today, just for different reasons. But let's not get too political. I do intend to actually visit Germany at some point in the near future. As part of his efforts to dig deeper into this distinction, Baumeister takes on a highly controversial group, and as we've already seen, that group is the Nazis. He dares actually ask the question, a question that modern discourse has rendered almost entirely verboten. Did the Nazis actually think of themselves as evil? Because if you look at any form of... what does the word Nazi even mean today? In fact, let me just look something up, because I just remembered that I have a quote. It's not a meme, but it is a quote from George Orwell that I want to see if I can find, because it's extremely funny to me. I'm annoyed because I normally pop these down onto my notes before I do them, but this literally just popped into my mind. I have a feeling that it is on my other hard drive, which would be rather irritating. But let me look it up. Let me look it up. Oh, yes, I love this one. I love this particular quote from good old George Orwell, although I do despise the fact I have to look it up on Reddit of all places. It will be seen that, as used, the word fascism is almost entirely meaningless. In conversation, of course, it is used even more wildly than in print. I have heard it applied to farmers, shopkeepers, social credit, corporal punishment, fox hunting, bullfighting, the 1922 Committee, the 1941 Committee, Kipling, Gandhi, Chiang Kai-shek, homosexuality, Priestley's broadcasts, young hostels, astrology, women, dogs, and I know not what else. That is a lovely quote from George Orwell. Magdalenus Rex here says, as much as I hate Hitler, his personal life behavior does not show the level of sadism or malice someone like Mao had. Mao was a sick, perverted freak. The Nazis thought they were legit saving the world. Hitler believed he was saving the world and allowing the true end of history that will be prevented by the Bolsheviks. He thought capitalism will fail and Bolshevism will use that. He was a zealot. And then Zuli says, the only one who I think thought of themselves as evil was the Squadron 415 in Japan and the Nazi doctor nicknamed Angel of Death. I mean, Mengele was a complete outright psychopath whose like twisted activities were just purely to satisfy his own obvious psychopathy. They had no... I think that the colleagues of Mengele actually burned his notes when he sent them to them, because even other eugenicists and Nazi scientists thought that his work was completely unethical and insane. And they also, actually, no, when we get to it, I'm going to talk about it. It mentions the group I was about to mention right now, so we'll get down into it in a moment. But as for Magdalenus Rex, yeah, when you mentioned Mao, I remember watching a video about Chairman Mao recently, and it pointed out that Chairman Mao was a very lustful man. He had a great big harem of young women that he liked to have sex with. Yeah, Unit 731, that's what Zuli mentioned. And the thing was that Mao had STDs. He was an unclean man. And these STDs, his personal doctors said to him he needed to clean himself up because he never bathed and he never showered either. So he was a disgusting person who was infested with STDs, crabs, and stuff like that. And his doctors told him, my lord, you must shower and you must bathe yourself when you are with your women. And his only reply to them was, I bathe myself inside my women. So, yeah, he was a really, really horrible freak. And, you know, Hitler, for all that he was a monster, his personal life kind of shows that he was at the very least capable of understanding, you know, how a person was supposed to act. Chiang Kai-shek was name-dropped. He was compared to Mao, a very humble, conservative, self-doubting man whose personal diary showed he hated his failures and the atrocities he feels necessary. Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of nuance to it all. I mean, even Joseph Stalin had a wife, and did Joseph Stalin have only... No, he had at least a son and a daughter. I don't know if he had other children, but from the accounts, he was actually quite nice to his children, and especially his daughter. It's quite ironic because Stalin had Lavrenti Beria, who was a serial rapist, and he was considered to be so evil that Stalin would not even let him in the same room as his children. And when Stalin considers you such a bad influence and such a dangerous man, he won't let you near his family. You've probably crossed a few moral event horizons. But yeah, let's not joke about Lavrenti Beria, because I've researched him. Oh my goodness, that man was absolutely horrifying. But yeah, there definitely is people like that, but that's kind of dragging us into the realm of sensationalism that this book actually tries to discourage people from considering, because one of the central points from chapter 1 is that evil is very often depicted in this larger-than-life capacity where we've hyper-focus on the people who have done the most evil and in the most grandiose ways, the most outlandish and the most shocking crimes, whereas we neglect the fact that those things tend to be the exception rather than the rule, and they don't provide a good frame of reference for the kind of evil actions that people are most likely to take in their day-to-day lives. So anyway, let us return to our notes as soon as I tab back in. Here we are. So again, he asked, did the Nazis actually think of themselves as evil? And as he continues, apparently the answer is no. Far from being a homogeneous group of mindless psychopaths, many individual Nazis strongly disagreed with the actions of their regime. Among those that engaged in the various atrocities of the Holocaust, there appears to have been a great variety of motives. But of all those motives, a pure desire to sadistically murder and torture others seems to have been almost entirely absent. So, what was the actual reason for them committing these crimes? And this is where things start to become very controversial indeed, because as has already been mentioned several times, Baumeister does not shy away from unpleasant topics that modern society tends to ignore and reject in its constant pursuit of black and white morality. And he's not afraid to point out things like this, because he delves very extensively into the social movements of the time, including the very often dismissed fact that prior to the Holocaust, fascism was a popular political movement in a variety of countries. And eugenics was never a prescribed field of scientific inquiry until much later. In fact, it was prior to the late 1930s. In fact, prior to the late 1930s, it was America, not Germany, that was leading the way in displacing native populations from their land. Debates about compulsory euthanasia and sterilization of the mentally retarded were perfectly acceptable. And he points out here as well in the text that he even goes so far as to say concentration camps were initially for relocating people, not for killing them. The systematic killings seem to have started only after alternative options for relocation became impractical. And I'm going to go a little bit off script for a second and mention this, because I have looked into quite a lot of material about the Holocaust, genocide, and Nazi ideology in general, and it's fascinating in a horrifying kind of way how the rationalization of all this, that's one of the reasons why I like this book, because it touches on in a fashion on a lot of the research that I've done in the past. And I really, well, there's so much you could go into, but I think one of the most prominent things is, I believe it was Heydrich. Was it Heydrich? Because all these bloody Germans have so many similar names. Heydrich Himmler. Was he German Nazi politician? One of the most powerful names. Yeah, architect of the Holocaust. Yeah, that's the guy. It's not the other Himmler, another Himmler. But it's fascinating because, like, Heinrich Himmler is often considered the architect of the genocide against the Jews. But what's really fascinating is that if you look at the personal diaries and the correspondence that he had with other Germans for a large part of World War II, he actually expresses this attitude of extreme annoyance and irritation that they are being, as he sees it, forced to commit this genocide, because like beyond all of the horrible things that he does, you know, Heinrich Himmler, he retains this kind of practical attitude towards things, and he basically said he rants several times saying, why the hell are we wasting so many resources on exterminating these peoples when we are engaged in a world war against multiple powers that are larger and stronger than we are and have more manpower? Like, don't you understand that every single SS soldier that you put guarding a concentration camp or operating, you know, a death oven is another soldier we could be using against the Russians? Don't you understand how many resources, like producing all the Cyclone B gas to kill the Jews, takes away from, you know, munitions factories that we could be using to create munitions to kill our enemies with? Why are we bothering for this? Why don't we just win the war first and then go about this activity? And it's another thing where it's horrifying to read. It's a disgusting thing to read because this guy is basically designing a method of more efficiently exterminating people, but it really does help underline Baumeister's like previous claims that people, even the worst kind of people, even the most seemingly cartoonishly evil people, very often they form these elaborate justifications and rationalizations for these actions. And that's why I really appreciate him going about the Nazi allegory very quickly, because it's such a gold mine of opportunity to explain the rationality of evil, which has been so just completely and utterly rejected by the mainstream. You're not allowed to discuss any of these nuances because the idea is, oh no, you're explaining the Nazis though, so therefore you must agree with them, because, you know, if you didn't agree with them, you would just condemn them out of hand and not listen to any of these dreadful justifications. Oh no, because, you know, you're not allowed to have nuance or anything in any kind of discussion. I really hate modern society. I really do. Only Heydrich and Durrell Wanger, oh dear, what an unfortunate name, and Mengelev seem like the most derangedly evil of any of the Nazi leaders. Yeah, I do agree. They were definitely like psychopathically evil Nazis who were into it entirely for the desire to murder, kill, and destroy, but those people were definitely a minority. I blame the US government. I mean, so do I. I mean, the thing is, I can understand. I'm not saying this is all a giant conspiracy theory or whatever. I mean, there's plenty of media manipulation and I would say cultural manipulation to view things in black and white, but I can completely understand why a normal functional person looks at something like the Holocaust and goes, I don't even want to think about reasons why someone would think this is okay. I would much rather look at the perpetrators of this atrocity and think they are not human, because that is easier for me to internalize. And I don't consider that a wrong perspective. I view it as a limited perspective, but I can completely understand why somebody would have that reaction to the Holocaust. I even think that's a lot to do with like genocide deniers as well. I think that an awful lot of genocide deniers are not denying the Holocaust because explicitly they hate the Jews or they love the Nazis, but instead because I think there's a tremendous force within the average person which goes, I don't want to believe that people are capable of evils on this scale. I do not want to exist in a world where people can do these kinds of horrific actions and even worse, go to sleep and have an easy night. Like, that does not sit well with me, so I am on a conscious and subconscious level going to try and pretend these things never happened, because I can't live in a society where humanity is capable of something like that. Again, I'm not trying to excuse genocide denial. I'm just presenting an idea of why some people might do it, okay? Zuli, as well as the people that sit on the Council of Foreign Affairs, and Magdalenus Rex, The reason the Nazis have to be portrayed is as they are is twofold. One, it's an easy scapegoat for nationalism and to hide the socialism that fueled its ideology. And also, now I've seen neo-Nazi denialists. They are legit psychopaths and the worst in mindset than the actual Nazis. I mean, there are plenty of very prominent genocide denialists who are unironically like, yeah, it never happened, but yeah, it should have happened and it should have been worse. Like that kind of nonsense. Most definitely. But I mean, I'm more talking about the kind of people, the kind of idiots you see on TikTok who just casually deny it as if to say, nah, fam, that never happened. That could never be like it, because people are getting stupider, not more intelligent. And I think that they're becoming more emotional and less analytical and less clever, honestly. Magdalenus Rex. They also deny Japanese atrocities and then call Chinese subhuman. I won't give my honest opinions there because it might get me banned. The Shortland Archive. I'd say that they were evil to the point of ceasing to be human. Perspective is very understandable one, especially when faced with such level of destruction of the humanity of others. I mean, yeah, I definitely agree. A and H types with pink registration dates. I know what you're referencing there. Those kind of people are the reason why I don't log in to Kiwi Farms when I browse it any longer, just so I don't even have to look at the board, at the A&H board. I'm very appreciative that Null made the Happenings board guest visible. If the Happenings board wasn't visible, yeah, I'd be logged into KF a lot more, but I just prefer not to be logged in any longer, so I'm not even tempted to look at A&H and see the kind of madness that goes on there. How Null hasn't deleted KF purely over the content of A&H, I have no idea. That man is the most stubborn of the entire universe. That man is not even a man anymore. Like, Null is pure donkey at this point. Right, anyway, let's return to my notes for a second. When it comes to the matter of the Jews, Baumeister again dares to take the highly controversial opinion that the Holocaust was mainly the result of all other options for removing the undesirable populations being deemed impractical by circumstances. He likens the Nazis not to deranged sociopaths, but to gardeners, ones who had a set vision for society and set about weeding out all the elements they deemed as standing in the way of that vision. Where are we? Yes. Though some gardeners can hate weeds, others view them as a pure inconvenience, but in the end, the weeds get pulled either way. Now, to quote the book directly, killing all of those people like weeding a garden boiled down to a fairly unpleasant chore that had to be done to achieve an envisioned wonderful outcome, one that would be a positive good for everyone, at least everyone who mattered to the Nazis. And I find that very, very true, and it's interesting as well because one of the things that I was exposed to when I was doing a lot of historical research was some research that the Nazis actually did during the Holocaust, and they were actually trying to calculate exactly how many people the average soldier could be forced to, innocent people that is, could be forced to kill and still remain sane. And I think they figured out the average German soldier could participate in about 1 or 2 unprovoked killings of civilians before he became likely to have a psychotic breakdown. And it's also from similar research that we know that it's only about 0.2% of the human population is able to spontaneously commit murder, as in pick up a gun and shoot someone in the head without provocation. So we know that, so thanks to the Nazis, we know that there are about 0.2% of the population that are natural psychopaths. And those were the kind of people that the Nazis very clinically tried to incorporate into groups like the SS, because they realized very quickly that it was almost impossible to motivate the average German soldier. Didn't matter how indoctrinated they were. They could be a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party who genuinely believed that Jews were subhuman filth, that they were, what is it they called, Untermenschen, or whatever it was. But when it came down to actually committing the act of genocide, almost all of those people just could not do it, could not manage it. They had tougher stuff back then. Proctor does that at least twice every other month. Does what? Does what? I look, Magdalena Rex, I look Kiev and I always cringe when I see this one guy with a Braille name unironically defend Stalin and Hitler and condemn Franco in the same breath. Look, you've just got to understand that some of these people are very, 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 very stupid. They are very, very stupid. Psychotic break. I only have a psychotic break every month or so. It's not twice a month, all right? And I mostly had a breakdown recently because my my medication was cut off just at random completely for no reason whatsoever. That was a very fun time. But I'm a lot better now. I only have schizophrenia occasionally now. I'm at least twice as mentally stable as Denpa Fish. Okay, all right. I am at least 2 Denpa Fishes worth of mental stability. Right? Okay. We all got that. We understand. Oh dear. Anyway, let us continue before things get even more crazy. Another vital element to understand the evil of the Nazi regime is to look at their backstory, because everyone has a Freudian excuse. In the 1930s, the average German citizen had every reason to believe his nation had been dealt with unjustly by outside forces. For example, the Germans had won a legitimate military victory against the Russian Empire in the east, making vast territorial gains, but had then been forced to give up all of that land and more after being defeated by the West. Baumeister also notes the cultural perception of warfare that played a major part in the post-war Germanic outlook, and this is another thing that I have reviewed myself to a tremendous degree. Before the Great War, Europe had enjoyed a generation of relative peace, prosperity, and stability. The few significant conflicts, such as the Franco-Prussian War, were brief and decisive, allowing people to buy into the fantasy that future wars would continue this trend. In brief, Europe had forgotten how horrific and destructive a continental war could be, even before factoring in modern technologies like long-range artillery, machine guns, and poison gas. And I found this most interesting as well because, again, I have looked very carefully about through history, and one of my favorite topics for a long time was World War I. And when I say World War I, I mean the causes of World War I. And it's really quite fascinating because the attitude before World War I, everybody was delighted at the prospect of war. In World War I, it's amazing how you read these history books. Like, the advent of World War I was greeted with cheers in Britain. They were delighted. All of the papers and the broadsheets would be like, "Oh, this is amazing. We finally get the chance to go out and beat up those damn Krauts and put them in their place. This'll all be over by Christmas, lads, and we'll whip them real good." And there were parades and there were dances, and like soldiers as they went off to the front lines were like kissed by women and had flowers thrown on them. And like the level of militant propaganda throughout societies was really, really endemic. I think it was to the point in France. There was a great example in a lecture that I once watched by a woman who was talking about the causes of the First World War. And she said that in France, the school books that were used in infant school for toddlers had questions in them like, if one French soldier can kill 5 German soldiers, how many German soldiers can 5 French soldiers kill? So it was on that level of desire for war that even the children's propaganda was talking about, children's school books were talking about war in Europe again. And so it's just such a massively different world that I find completely fascinating. And Ducato said 0.2% of would be 2 out of 1,000. That's a significant amount of any population. I mean, it's like the average. It's funny because Kirsha gets around 2,000, about 3,000 CCV on average now. I think her latest averages were like 2,700 CCV or so, and she got 10,000 CCV on her like Trump inauguration and assassination streams. So, on average, there's at least one serial killer in Kirsha's audience by now, statistically speaking. Magdalenus Rex, Christian ethics in the Middle Ages made us despise war outside the Crusades. Enlightenment and modernism crushed these restrictions and made us worship war for the people. Sickening philosophy. I do agree. That is another good point. That's just ridiculous. It was ridiculous, but remember, these people had no idea. They had forgotten what war was like, basically. There had been some wars, but those wars had mostly been foreign wars, or they'd been very quick and rapid wars that had been over without too much civilian casualties. Like the Franco-Prussian War was very quick and very decisive. Does Spino count as 2 SK? I don't think Spino counts as 2 of anything. I wonder how they felt after the first war was over. I mean, it was very, very devastating, and we're kind of going to get into that as well, so just make sure my page is correct. That's, what page am I on right now? That is 37, yes. Yes, here it is. One of all the summaries of the course of World War II, the best brief one I found, that Baumeister found, was that of John Keegan. And he says here, the First World War had been so much more horrible than anything Europeans had remembered or even imagined, that it produced a lasting and profound psychological impact. And this is the important point. The winners concluded there must be no more wars. The losers concluded there had to be another war to set things right. So much sacrifice could not be allowed in vain. So, in other words, he's pointing out that this was, and other historians have agreed with this. This is another case where the two sides were just operating on completely different outlooks. The Allies were basically like, this was so terrible, we can never repeat this again. Whereas the Germans were like, this was so terrible, we cannot let these injustices stand. We must put together a new war effort at some point in the future. And I'm just convinced that if it hadn't been... I agree with also the historians that say, if it hadn't been Hitler, it would have been someone else. Like, Hitler was the tyrant we got. But if Hitler hadn't risen up in Germany, someone else would have risen up to do basically the same thing as Hitler. Maybe not the genocide, maybe not the Nazism, but there would have been another war. And I do agree. I very, very much agree. It was a powder keg. Rin friends, the war to end all wars, if only they knew. Yep. Now then, let us scroll down a bit further to start the next part, which is the first subheading, I think, is Cruelty as an Unfortunate Byproduct, which also continues the Nazis' theme of things. Now, in this section, Baumeister comments on some of the viewpoints Nazis and former Nazis used to mitigate and justify the horrific actions of their regime, and these include 3 distinct points. The first point is minimization, aka the restoration of the German state to its former glory was of great enough accomplishment that it outshone the atrocities in terms of overall value and impact. 2. Relativism, aka you can't make an omelette without slaughtering a few million people. Some Nazis felt it was acceptable to commit evil in pursuit of a greater good. 3. Revenge, aka those who bought into such things as the stab in the back myth believed they were avenging the past wrongs done to the German people. Pardon me. And also, anticipating the attention span of the modern audience, Baumeister again emphasizes that we shouldn't use any of these as excuses to forgive or condone what the Nazis did, but we should instead use them to understand that it is vital that they thought they were justified in doing it. And you can see that all through the history books as well. In fact, with how much history is repeating itself today, no one teaches Weimar Germany. They don't teach Weimar Germany because they don't want you to remember what Weimar Germany was actually like. Kenneth Patterson, Europe never recovered from World War I spiritually or philosophically speaking. I agree with you. Magdalena's Rex, the issue with Hitler is that he was ideological. If it wasn't Hitler, it'd be a Franco figure and World War II wouldn't be so dramatic. I somewhat agree with you. I somewhat agree. I do unfortunately think that history might be repeating just a little bit in modern Germany, and well, I hope it doesn't blow up before I get to go to Dokomi, okay? I would really like to go to Dokomi and have a nice time, and I would like to meet up with a couple of people that I know now in the VTuber space, and that should be very fun and very interesting. Yeah, if anyone else is going to Dokomi, I would be more than happy to meet up with them. Just sling me a DM or something. The Shirt Lad Archive, so the Jerrys have been running on a roided up sunk cost mindset by that point. Pretty much, yeah. Rinfrendo, yeah, thoughts on how the German elections went. I am not going to get into it. I haven't paid a great deal of attention. I have no hope. Zero hope whatsoever of Europe getting unscrewed up anytime soon, and I'll just leave it at that because I don't want this to turn into a modern politics stream. I really don't. I don't enjoy modern politics at all at the moment. I'm just kind of happy that some places seem to be getting a little bit better, and let me put it this way. If any lovely VTubers in the USA would like to give me a green card, I would be more than happy to accept, okay? And I will quite happily prune their lawns and manicure their gardens for as long as they could possibly want in return. But yeah, I would really like to get out of Europe as soon as possible. I don't like Europe in any way at the moment, and I would rather be pretty much anywhere else. Anyway, let me just... Is this on a full... No, this is not on a full page, which is rather annoying. I'll have to scroll down. The only thing I don't like about this PDF is that it has like really awkward line breaks between the pages. The next week I might see if I can get a better PDF because this one is a bit awkward for chapter 3. Anyway, the conclusion that we can draw so far is that the perpetrators of evil are frequently ordinary, well-intentioned people with extensive rationalizations for their actions. Unfortunately, here we run into a significant problem. Major acts of evil like war crimes and genocides are seldom told from the perspectives of those who committed them. Victim narratives reign supreme, and while we should obviously listen to the victims of evil, we must also acknowledge their inherent biases as well. But just as such biases are evident in the narratives of perpetrators, Baumeister's own research demonstrates that they also... Sorry, let me go back to that for a second, because... Yes, this is an interesting section. My apologies. I misread that. Such biases are just as evident in the narratives of perpetrators, as Baumeister's own research aptly demonstrates. Now, this is an interesting part because he points out here in this section, to learn how perpetrators think, 2 graduate students and I collaborated on a research project designed to see how people would talk about something they had done that at least someone else thought was wrong. We asked people to write an account of a recent incident in which they had done something that made someone else very angry. For comparison, we also asked them to write an account of an event in which someone else made them angry. Thus, each person wrote 1 perpetrator story and 1 victim story. So yes, his reasoning is that by examining how ordinary people react to everyday situations where they perceive evil, insight can be gained into the thought processes which build up such situations into greater acts of evil, which we lack sufficient data to use as a primary source. Oh yeah, sound familiar? Sorry, one second. Lovely water, because yes, a major issue is, of course, that it's very hard to find accounts of all of these events from the perspective of those who perpetrate them. And I also find it really disgusting how in recent years media has gone out of its way to kind of censor the narratives of people like, for example, the school shootings in America that occurred recently. They've tried to suppress the manifestos that those school shooters released. They have tried to pretend that various people committed crimes for reasons which their own narratives say they didn't. And they've generally refused to allow people to express themselves after they have committed crimes for the fairly obvious reason that it prevents them from spinning those events to a narrative that suits their own politics, which I find is incredibly disgusting and extremely upsetting. Because if you want to be able to prevent crimes in the future, you do need to listen to the voices of the perpetrators as well as the victims. You should always take a critical eye on it, and Baumeister here in this chapter, he says many times, even though you should listen to perpetrators, you shouldn't take the perpetrator's word over the victim by default. That's not what he's trying to convey to the reader. And it's something that I think a lot of stupid people will take away from this, is that, he's just saying we should listen to the perpetrator rather than the victim. Whereas though that's not the case in any way whatsoever. But it's a very hard thing to convey to the average person, and it's something that I found very frustrating in dealing with other people, in that the moment you start mentioning the perspective of the people that committed a crime, other people automatically assume that you're trying to justify or somehow neutralize the impact of that crime, or that you're denying the victim a voice, whereas it's the kind of Twitter mentality. It's that whole thing where that joke about how Twitter is that if you say you like something, then somebody else will say, oh, that means you must hate the opposite thing. And it's a really stupid way of talking and discussing matters that has seeped into common consciousness, which I really wish would go away, which is really bloody annoying. So anyway, we've got this section here, how bad was it? And he says here that the initial conclusion to this study that he ran reinforces his hypothesis that perpetrators naturally see less evil in their actions than victims. And he says here, while his subjects often admitted wrongdoing in part, they usually supplied mitigating circumstances and justifications for their actions. He notes here that warmongering nations habitually use this defense. Where are we now? Sorry, I've stopped. Yes, here it is. Claiming that violence they use to inflict on others is justified by legitimate rights. A minority of subjects that in Baumeister's study also claimed complete innocence, feeling a sense of total justification and claiming the victim of their offense was unreasonable in their objections to it. And as he points out here, again, these research findings are based on minor transgressions, typically among friends and relatives, but one does not have to look far to find similar patterns among people who commit serious crimes. And this is something that he starts doing quite a lot. He starts citing and quoting the works of other sociologists, psychologists, and researchers, which I really do like. It says here, Diane Scully's interviews with convicted rapists found them using similar arguments to reduce the severity of their offenses. They blamed alcohol or other factors, and some even claimed that rape became an addiction, so they could not stop themselves from raping women once they had tasted this forbidden pleasure. God, I hate the government because they certainly love that. Dear. And I'm just going to read this part verbatim because it's very, very, very disturbing. The prize for minimizing one's crime must go to one serial murderer and rapist whom Scully interviewed in prison. His account would be almost humorous if it were not for his shocking actions and his appalling insensitivity to the victim's suffering. This young man had captured 5 different women at gunpoint and raped them, after which he stabbed them to death. It is difficult to imagine how anyone could regard such acts as anything but brutal, cruel, and evil. Yet the man described them in quite different terms. He said he had always made sure to be kind and gentle with them, at least until he started to kill them. He claimed they enjoyed having sex with him, which is almost certainly false. And even the murders seemed less heinous in his retelling. The killing was always sudden, so they wouldn't know that it was coming. Isn't that reassuring, guys? Isn't that reassuring? Such a nice murderer. Is he talking about Uncle Ted? Oh dear. Goodness me. Let's hope not. Let's pray not. I mean, we can obviously tell that this particular guy that we're talking about right here is the kind of psychopath who genuinely believes that they've done nothing wrong, even when they've very, very obviously done a huge amount of things wrong. But this next section here, deliberate and intentional, is something that I find particularly fascinating because it, let me just scroll down a little bit. There we are. As for the victim narratives produced by the study, two major themes rapidly emerge. One is that the victim emphasizes the unreasonableness of the perpetrator, how senseless and capricious they were. The other describes them as intentionally malicious, leaving no other room for plausible explanation besides deliberate sadism or meanness. Baumeister reminds us now that these two stories, one from the perspective of a victim and one from that of a perpetrator, were written by the same person. So, basically, to recap this, what he's doing is he's giving people two stories to write, and in one story they are the victim of an activity that was done to them. In the other, they are the perpetrator of the activity that they did to somebody else, and they're being asked to describe their feelings, their motivations, etc. And it's the same person writing both of these stories, but the patterns remain the same, is that even though it's the same person, they're using the same justifications that the victim uses to call the perpetrator evil, as a perpetrator, to say the victim either deserved it or to minimize their crime. And they don't seem to be able to understand that. They don't seem to be able to connect the two halves of the equation. So if one of them writes a story about a victim, then they'll say, oh, I did it to them, but, you know, I think they overreacted. I did it. They don't understand that I did this because of that thing over there. I was in a bad mood. Okay, I had a bad day. So they're minimizing the effects of the actions that they commit to the victim. But then when they are asked to describe an example of themselves as a victim of something, they will flip right round to the other side of the equation and go, it was dreadful, it was awful, I have no idea why the other person did this to me, I feel really hurt and I feel really upset, there was no reason for them to do that at all, I did nothing to provoke it, and what's more, I think this person was incredibly unreasonable, they were harsh towards me, I don't see any reason for it, and I'm not going to forgive them, or they apologized but it wasn't enough. It's that kind of thing. And hopefully a decent number of people that are chatting here can kind of understand these two sides of things, because sir, she decided to go out on those clothes. I mean, fortunately, they're not talking about like rape or murder, but more like common things, like somebody getting into an argument or a row, not major serious crimes that these people have committed, but this puts me in mind of the problem between training somebody to do something and then that person being able to do that thing in real life, because one of the major problems that experience mitigates is that even though you can be trained to do something, when the time comes to actually do that thing in the real world, you're often going to have a great deal harder time doing that than you might expect. It's a bit like, for example, say a surgeon being trained on corpses, on cadavers. A surgeon might be able to perform a surgery perfectly on a cadaver 100 times out of 100. And yet, if that surgeon has never operated on a human patient, it's very likely the first time they do so, their hands are going to be shaking a bit more, they're going to be a lot more nervous, and they're going to find it much harder to actually do. They may well still succeed, but they're still going to feel that level of tension and apprehension during that thing. So in the moment, things are going to be a lot harder for them. And I think that effect is extremely prevalent when it comes to confrontation as well. Because it's very easy, as we're looking at this from an outside perspective, to understand the inherent silliness of it. Like, I'm sure that after reading this or summarizing this to you, if I asked each person in my audience right now to go away, sit down, and write out 2 stories, one about being a perpetrator and one about being a victim, they would be able to realize that they shouldn't engage in justifying actions as the perpetrator, and that as the victim, they should try and see the perpetrator's side a bit more obviously. But at the same time, in the moment, when it actually happens, the emotions you're going to experience is going to be a lot more dramatic and direct. For example, I am not somebody who is a violent person. I'm not an aggressive person by nature. And I would never, or I won't say never, but I would not instinctively want to hurt another person. And yet, if somebody came up to me in the street and slapped me in the face, my natural reaction would probably be to slap them back. And so it's a case of, from my rational, not arbitrary, but external perspective, I have no desire to commit violence upon another person, but the impulsive part of my brain is going to default to that if I'm suddenly forced into that situation with no warning and no time to prepare. And I think that that plays a great part in the kind of relationships and actions that Baumeister is dealing with here, that he's discussing here, that he's pointing out that even though people can intellectually understand the perspectives of both victim and perpetrator in these kind of scenarios, the more natural human, or in fact almost animalistic and instinctive side of them is going to very easily default to these assumptions as both victim and perpetrator, even though they're the same people. It's a natural instinct that you need to be able to step outside yourself to counteract and overcome. As Magdalenus Rex said, this level of ability to rationalize usually needs an average or higher IQ. The evil caused by higher time preference individuals tend to be wholly irrational and irredeemably evil. Can you explain what you mean by higher time preference individuals? Because, yeah, I don't quite understand what you mean by that, Magdalenus Rex. That's not a reference that I really get, I'm afraid. Ow, I've also got a slight headache. Let me just take another drink of water. Okay, let me scroll down a bit more because there is another subsection here. Yes, there was just an extra tiny bit of stuff. So, we reach this next subheading. What to do with bygones, the elastic time frame. And as he says here, let me just scroll down to the full part. Yes. Another major difference between the stories of victims and perpetrators is that of the time frames involved. Victims ponder and ruminate on past offences committed against them. Perpetrators, meanwhile, have the motto, let bygones be bygones. Baumeister attributes this to the magnitude gap, which is something that we discussed, I believe, in the past chapter, where the magnitude gap is essentially where... Sorry, dear. I apologize if you hear me belching. That's not my intention. But the magnitude gap was discussed in Chapter 1, where it is basically the amount of trauma a victim experiences is usually vastly greater than the amount of pleasure or satisfaction that a perpetrator gains out of committing a crime or an evil action or violence against another person. So basically, if I punch someone, then I will probably get pleasure out of punching them if I feel justified in doing so. But the bruise and the pain of being punched is going to linger a lot longer than the pleasure and satisfaction I get out of punching someone. Thusly, that creates a magnitude gap where the victim is going to view my punch to their face as far more impactful on their life than I will as having punched them. And I like this paragraph down here at the bottom. One important reason for the time span difference is probably the magnitude gap. What the perpetrator gained was generally smaller than what the victim lost, so the perpetrator has less reason to replay that memory. And of course, replaying memory is the primary way that your brain reinforces neuron connections and makes things stronger in your head. Sorry, I just got to pop up on my screen. Go away. The event affected the victim much more than the perpetrator, and so it would almost inevitably tend to linger in their memory and come up more often. Magdalenus Rex, euphemism for future scholars or peaceful migrants, and when they do terrible shit, they literally can't self-reflect due to IQ. Yes, I remember the copy pasta from, or the green text, rather than the copy pasta, the green text. The famous 4chan green text, which was hit a little bit too close to home. I do wonder how many people, like psychologists and so on, hang out on places like 4chan. Surprisingly, I would say that it's more than people normally think so. Now, the next thing that we're going through is the Seeing Oneself Under Attack subheading, which says that our research was not the only project to tackle the perpetrator's mentality. And as it says, the book now cites a study in which emotionally disturbed and violent boys were shown photographs of various social interactions and then asked to describe the activities occurring within them. The conclusion was very interesting. The researchers quickly learned that these boys saw hostility and aggression even in normal, everyday events, and this trend continues in studies that analyze incidents of domestic violence. Abusive husbands tended to see personal attacks where there were none, interpreting the most innocuous comments by their spouse as a sign of insolence or defiance worthy of punishment. To these deeply insecure men, their pride and dignity are under constant assault, and that assault justifies a violent response. And I can empathize at least with the first part of this, because fortunately I have never been in an abusive relationship, and my parents are not abusive towards one another, which seems to be a terrifying rarity in the modern era. But when it talks about this study about boys who were naturally violent, or not naturally violent, but were violent boys and their perceptions of hostility in otherwise innocuous social interactions, I can relate to that a great deal, because when I was young, when I was much younger, I was home educated, but before I was home educated because of my autism, I did not fit well into the school setting at all. I was briefly, my parents trialed me out in several programs for people that had basically not been able to cope with regular school. And I was like in my early teens at that time, and I think that I can definitely agree with this analysis here, because I remember, because I'm autistic, obviously, I don't have the most natural social, especially when I was a teenager. I had much fewer I had much lower social perception than I do now. And I was in a environment with a lot of, shall we say, not brilliant intellects. There were some that were genuinely intellectually disabled, but not malicious, as it were. But there were plenty of little bastards, basically. Little bastards who didn't fit into the school system at all. There wasn't anything mentally wrong with them. They were just bastards. I'm sure you know the type. And what I found very quickly was that a lot of them were very aggressive towards me for reasons that at the time I couldn't understand at all. And they were aggressive to me, so I was fortunately taken out of that situation before I could be seriously bullied or even potentially harmed. But a tremendous amount, because the way that I speak right now has been the way that I've spoken pretty much my entire life. So, yeah, I use a lot of long words. I use complex grammar, complex sentence structure, and a lot of details. You could say that for even the not mentally disabled. Yeah, definitely. Unfortunately, modern society is a place. It's definitely a place. Joker quote. But the way that I spoke provoked aggression from an awful lot of these other boys, these other children that I was with at the time, and an awful lot of them, because I was able to speak to the staff on a very adult level, I was able to talk to them quite a lot, and some of these staff, they were genuinely nice people. They tried their best to help me and the other children, so I'll always appreciate that. But many of them said, it's the way you speak. It's the way you speak, Proctor. They listen to the way you speak, and they feel intimidated, and they feel threatened by it. Probably ran to you... I think you mean probably mad at you because you kept telling them they were intellectually disabled. I mean, I didn't literally call them intellectually disabled. But yeah, the teacher said, look, Proctor, it's because you use long words around them and they feel as if you are attacking them. And I asked them, why do they think that I'm attacking them? All I'm doing is speaking. And they said it's because they feel as if you using long words means you think they're too stupid to understand what you really mean, or you're talking down to them by using long words. And I was just like, excuse me, that's their problem, not mine. Why am I being victimized for the fact that I actually have a proper way of speaking and talking? Excuse me? So yeah, those were not programs that I stayed in for a very great deal of time. But unfortunately, my sophistication has always caused me to be somewhat ostracized by the rest of society. But it's also very much why I became terminally online, because I found that I found a few people online that were able to match me in those terms, and we have been extremely close friends ever since, and they are very much responsible for helping me to really appreciate the kind of person that I could be. Also, Thrang, why are you beeping at me? Sorry, Thrang just said something rather funny to me in DMs. Friend, it does make you seem bigger, more mature. A lot of people use slang nowadays. You rarely even consider it. I've never been exposed to that kind of thing. Never been exposed to it. I was raised on Radio 4. Like, if anyone here has listened to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that was what I was listening to when I was 2 years old. My goodness, that is such an amazing radio play. Zuli, you would have probably been blamed for not playing the game. Can I just say I hate that so much mentally, so much. Yeah, I understand. Ow, my leg. Sorry, I've had my legs tucked underneath me for too long. Now, where were we? Let us get back to this. Yes, abusive husbands tended to see personal attacks where there were none, interpreting the most innocuous comments by their spouse as a sign of insolence or defiance worthy of punishment. To these deeply insecure men, their pride and dignity are under constant assault, and that assault justifies a violent response. And I like this example here that's given where it says, suppose, for example, that two couples are talking one evening, and one couple mentions that they recently enjoyed a great meal at a very expensive restaurant. They describe the excellence of the food and the shocking size of the bill. The other husband turns to his wife and says casually that the two of them ought to try that place sometime. The wife responds, I don't know, dear. It sounds awfully expensive. Now, obviously, a normal husband would realize that his wife is just trying to get him to not spend very large amounts of money. But this one, well, I'll read this again. A few husbands might take that remark as a criticism. She is implying that he doesn't earn enough money. She is saying he's a failure as a provider and as a man. She thinks he's not as good as other men who can afford such fancy meals. And she's saying this right in front of their friends, to humiliate him publicly. She's being really mean to him and making him feel and look terrible. He'd better teach her a lesson. Short Lad Archive. The Tism tangent did remind me of my early days. Yeah, many such cases. Many such cases. Mad Lettuce Rex, I've been raised from my interest to speak like Cicero mixed with Lovecraft. I mean, it's better than the average idiot. Very definitely. Now, a second citation backs this assertion up, which points out to a study that asked men to evaluate interactions with their spouses to determine whether or not their pride had been damaged during them. Husbands with a record of abuse were over twice as likely to come away with wounded pride than non-abusive husbands. Abusive husbands tend to interpret many of their wives' behaviors as assaults on their own self-esteem. Which, you know, I don't agree with it, but I can understand what they're saying here. I've noticed this interplay a great deal between, because I go to church, I get exposed to a lot of what I would call stable married relationships. And I've gotten to have good conversations with both partners of those relationships. And I find it really fascinating to compare the way they speak about each other. There's several examples that spring to mind. One is there's a couple that I know, which have been married for like 50 years, so they have a very good relationship. But the wife very often says, my husband doesn't believe me when I say there's a problem with something. Like, for example, she drives a car, and she's very kind of sensitive about the thing, and her husband is a mechanic. And she's very sensitive about problems with her car. She likes to keep her car in good working order. But she says, my husband just doesn't believe me when I say there's a problem with my car. He always needs to go out and sit. Sorry, I'm going to get a bit closer to the microphone. My frames are dropping a little bit, so I do apologize. But she says, when I say there's a problem with my car to my husband, he'll never believe me just saying there's a problem. He always has to take my keys, he has to get in my car, turn the engine on, and he has to drive it for himself to find out there's a problem. And only after he does that will he admit to me that there is, in fact, a problem that he needs to fix. I don't understand why he can't just take my word and fix my car. But I've also had conversations with the husband, and he said, my wife tends to overreact to things a great deal. She very often comes to me saying there's a problem with this and a problem with that. And to make sure that I don't start doing things that I don't need to, I always like to check and make certain that it's actually a problem that needs fixing before I get into it. And I feel like I save an awful lot of time and energy and resources by doing that. And it was fascinating to me. And the thing is that both of them have heard this argument from each other before. So they're aware of each other's reasoning for this. But it's another case of what I said, like I said before, is that instinctively in the moment, they're not able to kind of compartmentalize, or they overly compartmentalize. They're not able to take the explanations of each other's behavior into account when dealing with new circumstances of it. So they'll always do the same thing. Like the wife will go to the husband and say, there's a problem with my car. And so the husband will say, okay, dear, give me the keys. I'll go and drive it and see if there's a problem. And so the wife comes away feeling miffed that she's not being taken seriously. And the husband is like miffed that she doesn't appreciate the effort that he's putting into making sure the car is actually in need of fixing. And I've known this for years. Like, this has been a recurring theme of their conversations for many years. And again, these are people in a very good relationship that have known each other for decades and decades and like are in their 60s or 70s. But it's always been a thing of their relationship. And it's just really fascinating to me to hear the different perspectives of them and see that, you know, even though these people are very close, they are very intimate, they have like 4 or 5 children that they've all raised well, even after all this time, there are gaps in their perceptions when it comes to each other that they can't reconcile. No matter how many times these scenarios come up, there'll always be this kind of almost ritualistic sense of friction between them that has to play out. And again, it doesn't destroy their relationship. They don't have massive arguments. They don't have massive fallouts over it. But neither of them seems able to internalize the reasoning for the other, at least to the point where they can get over that instinctive sense of frustration and like mild sense of distrust and betrayal they experience each time it plays out. Again, that's a massive tangent, but it does, I think, illustrate it helps to illustrate this more extreme example where, like as it says, a wife can be commenting casually on the price of a meal, and her husband can take it as her meaning, "Oh dear, you don't earn enough money for us to visit expensive places like that. You're a loser. You're a failure." So I can understand this a bit more than I think the average person, and we'll get back to the whole abuse thing in future, because the very next green highlighting talks about street violence, so I'll continue on that. But trust me, we will be circling back around to this whole thing eventually, quite quickly, actually. We're taking a bit longer to go through this than I thought, actually, because there's still a fair amount left. Let me get to my notes. Where are they? There they are. So, as it says here, similar observations have been made about street violence. And yes, here's my notes. Let me just scroll down to the full page. Baumeister now connects this with incidents of street violence. In many cases, it is a wound to a man's pride that incites him to violence, which he considers a fair reprisal to the harm done to him by the victim. From this, we draw the entirely logical conclusion that hanging around hypersensitive people is disadvantageous to one's health. Where is the... Yes, this point here. I like this paragraph in particular. The driving force was his own pride, his high self-esteem, his male ego. He was so intent on being superior to her, this is talking about an abusive husband, by the way, that he watched her for any little episode or remark that could possibly be interpreted as reflecting badly on him, and whenever he found one, he turned violent against her in response. And then it brings this back home to thing. If you accept his need for high self-esteem as a given, then on his terms, he was at least partly justified in beating up his wife later on, after she had belittled him and humiliated him in front of their friends. Which is a really, really, really hard statement to make. And it brings us to... I won't necessarily call this my favorite section of the book so far, but it is one that I think makes the most impact. Allow me to have a drink of water. Which is the section, Who is Correct? And Baumeister is not one to shy away from the difficult questions. He dares to poke at the near sacred traditional narrative that the victim should always be believed over the perpetrator. Now, first of all, he points out that both sides of the equation often sincerely believe what they're saying. And also, he points out there's the major problem that one needs objective evidence that often simply isn't available. But fortunately, he once again brings the citations of professional psychologists into the whole affair. Because coming to our rescue is the work of the psychologist Arlene Stilwell, and she conducted an experiment which involved giving a story to various participants, who then had to recite what happened to them as either victim or perpetrator. Now, this method allowed Stilwell to compare potential exaggerations against the objective facts of the supplied story, and crucially, the story was identical for all participants. Now, if you look at the double highlighted green text here, like the results of this says, Stilwell's experiment showed that both victims and perpetrators distorted facts to an equal degree. Now, the victims exaggerated the harms that were done to them, but perpetrators downplayed the severity of their actions. Remember, that's something we talked about earlier, is that perpetrators, when they're asked to tell a story with themselves as the perpetrator, will justify and downplay their actions. Whereas if they're even the same person who is then asked to become a victim and describe a crime done to them as a victim will say the person did more harm to them than they would if they were the perpetrator describing that from the same incident from the opposite perspective. Now, Baumeister points out, this makes relying on the testimony of one side or the other empirically unsound, especially in cases of violence or emotional harm, because remember the magnitude gap. Perpetrators have highly complicated and intricate reasonings for their actions, and often rely on the moral ambiguity of a situation to justify their actions. Meanwhile, victims are more likely to see things in black and white. The perpetrator is a monster, while the victim is a virtuous innocent. As he points out in this paragraph here, one cannot rely on either the victim's story or the perpetrator's. The reality may lie somewhere in between. No one story can be fully trusted in a scientific sense, although most stories do contain some significant elements of truth. And I also like this point here. In addition to the perpetrators, a misdeed may seem like an isolated event in the distant past that has no relation to the way they live their lives in the present. Divo Leon. Oh, hi, Divo Leon. It's nice to see you again. You haven't been around for quite a long time. I do appreciate seeing you around again. Can the paragraph about the abusive husband be classified as a type of narcissism? If your life isn't centered around me and me only, you will suffer for it. I think that's also quite a reasonable attitude to have. I do believe that narcissism plays a great deal, a big role in a lot of these cases. However, if you haven't been around for the first chapter, Baumeister points out that he, at least in his opinion, and I do believe him when he says this, that mental illness is very rarely a good explanation for the reasons that people commit these kind of actions, because it's very easy to look at these circumstances and say, oh, this person is just a narcissist. I remember narcissism was really in vogue a year or so ago, and there was a lot of research that was done on it. There was a lot of podcasts that talked about it, and I remember a psychologist who was talking about narcissism, and she pointed out, I've studied narcissism for years and years and years. The thing is that most people have moments of being narcissists in their lives. Narcissism is not thinking that you yourself are the focus of all attention or that you're the only one that can be right, because everybody feels like that at some point. Narcissism is when you're always like that. And I do think that it's possible, even for someone who has either the potential or even literally has been an abusive partner before, to not be a narcissist in other contexts, if that makes any kind of sense. I do think that there are some people in life who are fundamentally incompatible with certain behaviors and styles of existence, and it would be better off, for example, if those people stayed single. However, I don't think that somebody who might be the kind of man who'd beat their spouse is necessarily a narcissist in the sense of they are all encompassing in their perception that the universe revolves around them. Divo Leon, I started college last month, needed some time to start a schedule. I'll join the server again in the future, just don't know when. That's cool, that's nice to hear. I did enjoy having you around. What are you studying, by the way, if you don't mind me asking? I do hope you're doing well at college. But it's definitely good to see you again. Allow me to just very quickly check my DMs, because I've got a bunch of them. Also, I should probably close that while it's on. Every single time I stream, I always get tons of DMs. I'll just rest my throat for about 5 seconds. Okay, let's continue. I do really enjoy this next section as well, when perpetrators become victims, because we're going to circle back to the Nazis again, that wonderful group. Amber Heard certainly has a lot to say about that. Yeah, definitely. Multimedia production. I want to specialize in audio mixing / recording. Hey, that's cool. There's a guy that I know. I once worked with a YouTube channel that had a huge amount of subscribers. Actually, it was a big channel at the time. It's kind of gone downhill since I left, and for no reason whatsoever. It's so tragic. But yeah, there was a guy there who was 13 years old, and he was working as a media producer for this channel. He was one of the best people there, actually. He was a really cool guy. I really hope that he's getting on well in life. That was quite a few years ago now. He would be about 17 by now, I think, probably. But yeah, he was really cool. But yeah, it seems he got paid like really well for it too. He was genuinely out there like doing proper professional level work at age 13, and he was doing really well. So it's definitely something that's in demand. And yeah, audio mixing and recording is something that I would love to get into a bit more myself, because I am constantly very self-conscious about how my voice sounds on audio as opposed to in real life. My voice sounds a lot deeper in real life than it does on audio. I've just had a terrible luck with microphones. It would probably help if I wasn't recording in a wooden shed, which probably does not have the best acoustics in the entire universe. But let's actually get on with this. Where the hell is my tabs? There we are. Mixing and blurring the roles when perpetrators become victims. As we have seen, perpetrators seldom blame themselves for offences to the same extent as victims. In fact, many go so far as to view themselves as victims of an even bigger crime. Now, this is very dramatically illustrated by this guy, Peter Sikrovsky, who interviewed the children of Nazi war criminals. In one case, the daughter of a Nazi war criminal had found herself simply incapable of viewing her father as a monster whose actions had contributed to the deaths of millions. And this quote here, he says, he quoted one woman who recalled her father after the war as a nervous, trembling man in constant fear that the police would get him. 4 of us were living in a single room. My father had no work and was afraid to go out in daytime. She went on to say how that memory of him as a victim precluded seeing him as a criminal perpetrator. Is that what power-hungry monsters responsible for the deaths of millions look like? I could never see my father in that role. Now, this next section is absolutely hilarious, as hilarious as, you know, talking about the children of the men who perpetrated the Holocaust can be. I will read this part verbatim because it's really, really funny in a kind of very, very, very sick way. Indeed, the efforts of the Third Reich's children to distance themselves from their guilty families have often involved remarkable pursuits of the victim role for themselves. Many of these children sought out Jewish friends, married Jews, or converted to Judaism themselves. Others chose careers as public defenders or Amnesty International functionaries, where they could work on behalf of political prisoners and other victims of oppression. Others sought out desperate causes that promoted the welfare of various oppressed groups, and some committed suicide, which, as Baumeister says, is an effective way of claiming a prominent role of victim for oneself. I do love Baumeister's humor in this, because he has a very kind of dry humor and like subtle sarcasm in these instances, which I really do appreciate. I think I would get along very well with him if we ever met in real life. We seem to vibe on the same level. But this next part, which I've highlighted in green, is my favorite of the whole thing. You will apologize if I laugh during this, if you're offended by this kind of thing, but I find it completely hilarious. In one case, the daughter of a prominent Nazi had carried on a long love affair with a Jewish man. She wanted to marry him, but found herself unable to return to his home with him, because in his home in South Africa, he, as a white man, belonged to the class of oppressors. Apparently, she wanted to link herself to a victim, and although he qualified very well as a Jew, he became disqualified as a white man in the land of apartheid. In his home country, he was not a victim, so she couldn't marry him. Oh, I love that. That is so funny to me. That is just so absurd, but it also so entertaining. I probably should not laugh at that kind of thing, but I really do find it hilarious. But what's much less funny, I will move on from this before further commentary can be made. But yes, there is a much less funny part here. The same mindset of victimhood extends even to the most blatantly guilty perpetrators who have committed the most heinous of crimes. Serial killers, in particular, are known to exhibit this mindset. Arthur Shawcross blamed childhood molestation for his sexual offences, while prolific murderer John Wayne Gacy has gone on record stating, "I see myself more as a victim than a perpetrator," even lamenting that the media presented him as an asshole and a scapegoat. Oh no. Oh no. And also this part. Thus, he saw himself as the victim of misunderstanding and lack of sympathy, causing him to wonder whether anyone could understand how badly it had hurt to be John Wayne Gacy. Now, let me just... John Wayne Gacy kill count. John Wayne Gacy was an American serial killer and sex offender who raped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men and boys in Norwood Park Township near Chicago, Illinois. He became known as the Killer Clown due to his public performances as a clown prior to the discovery of his crimes. Oh, he's the clown from the Acid Bath album cover. I think being drowned in acid would be a gentle thing to do to this guy. They're just saying that to avoid accountability. Hello, Armored Glass Cannon, by the way. I mean, yeah, the chapter does get into this. It gets into this later, actually, so we will get into that in just a moment. Now, all of this leads to quite an interesting aside on the nature of the death penalty, because Baumeister notes that those condemned to death row frequently express moral outrage at what they perceive as the hypocrisy of the state. Now, their argument is simple. If they are to be put to death for a spontaneous killing, the state itself is guilty of a much greater crime by taking part in their own premeditated execution. Now, I like these two sentences here, which says, the legal system itself says that premeditated murder is worse than a crime of passion. So, these convicted men reason, what the state does to me is far worse than what I may have done to my victim. I may have committed a crime, but all in all, I am a bigger victim than a perpetrator. Thus speaks death row. Now, before we get into this next part, there's something that I want to look up. I'm annoyed that I didn't look this up previously, but allow me to see if I can try and find this. I really hope that I can. It might I will be very annoyed if I can't find this. I can't. I have found it. I have found it. I will read this. I will read this on. I will read this in just a moment, because as you can see maybe at the bottom of this page, we're going to talk about Serbia in a moment. Divo Leon, just to close my comment, the album's name is When the Kite String Pops. The band Acid Bath used 2 paintings made by serial killers for their album covers, the most famous one made by Gacy. Ugh. Oh dear. Now, we've already discussed the Nazis and the Holocaust, but we're now going to return to this because we're departing from the acts of personal violence for a little while, because Baumeister is returning to the opening themes by discussing the gruesome ethnic violence that occurred during the breakup of Yugoslavia. Despite having been accused of being the perpetrators of some of the worst human rights violations during the conflict, the Serbs continue to view themselves as the victims, with a long list of grievances against those they see as former oppressors. To quote a reporter on the subject, "Far from being weighed down by guilt, the Serbians consider themselves, if anything, the most aggrieved party in the Bosnian nightmare. Indeed, one of the most aggrieved parties in the entire world. Visitors are lectured about Turkish atrocities against the Serb people going back to 1389, nearly 1,000 years ago." Now, there are very obvious parallels here between the Serbian experience and that of the former Nazi Party members of the Second World War. It's extremely difficult to motivate anyone besides a tiny minority of psychopaths to willfully commit war crimes. Whether that be genocide, mass rape, or ethnic cleansing out of pure self-interest or a desire to do evil for evil's sake. Instead, a complex web of justifications, past crimes, and inherited suffering must be woven to cushion the individual from the moral outrage they are causing, allowing them to engage in heinous behavior in the name of the greater good. And as this paragraph says, they tend to look for whatever will help them believe what they want to believe, namely that they should be regarded as victims rather than evildoers. And this is where the thing that I wanted to read comes in, because a very long time ago, I used to have quite a lot of Slavic friends. And after a lot of exposure to my Slavic friends, I wrote about what I call the Slav lecture. And the Slav lecture I detailed once on Kirsch's server, and I shall read the post that I made about the Slav lecture in full now, because it is very stereotypical. And the trouble is, every single person that I've told this Slav lecture to has said, yeah, they're basically like that. So I will read this now. Every single Slav I have ever known for long enough has given me the Slav lecture. What is the Slav lecture exactly? Basically, the Slav lecture is where your Slav friend looks you in the eye and drops back into his native accent as he reminisces about the pure and free times before the Soviet Union / Ottoman Empire / insert oppressive foreign occupier here ruined everything. He will then slowly bring it round to his ancestors, who will all invariably have lived pure and free lives before dying heroically in defense of their beloved nation. After this, the Slav lecture transitions into repeated and emphatic declarations of how peace-loving, loyal, and family-orientated this particular man's ethnic subgroup of Slavs always are, and how their fondest wish is to live in peace and harmony with all men. Then, finally, his eyes will narrow, and he will look past your ear. This is the critical point of the Slav lecture, and your last chance to disengage safely. If you fail to distract him fast enough, the Slav lecturer will begin talking about those Slavs, aka all Slavs not part of his particular ethnic subgroup. He will speak in general terms at first, but as his gesticulations grow in intensity, one particular group will always be singled out. He will be interjecting a minimum of 3 reminders about how peace-loving his own ethnic group is per minute at this point. Yet finally, the culmination of the Slav lecture occurs with a total denunciation of the aforementioned group, complete with emphatic and encyclopedic recountings of their misdeeds towards his own ethnic subgroup. Then he will look you straight in the eye again and say something that is always a paraphrase of the following statement. We are a peaceful people. We love our neighbors. But we can only be peaceful and love our neighbors after we have killed every single one of those bastards, tracked down all of their surviving relatives, killed them too, and pissed on their graves. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Slav lecture. Magdalenus Rex, ever relevant for the whole Russia-Ukrainian war. I've grown to be tired of Slavs, and this is from a guy who is Orthodox Christian. Yeah, as I've said, I have recounted or reposted that post that I made on Kirsch's server multiple different places, in places where I've known like Slavs hang out, and every single Slav that I've showed it to has said, yeah, I know what you're talking about. That's a bit too you got every part of this right. Slav lecture makes KKK look like innocent babies. The Shut Lad archive. I'm a Slav, can confirm. The thing is, it always seems to shock. It always seems to shock like Europeans or Westerners when I recite that lecture, and yet every single time I speak to someone in Eastern Europe and I share that with them, they're all like, "Yeah, actually, you know what? You kind of understated it a bit. I think you could go a bit more extreme than that and still be accurate." Oh dear, I really, that's one of my favorite things that I've ever written on the internet, honestly. And don't get me wrong, I really like talking to Slavs. Like, Slavs are really most normal Slav interaction with his neighbors. Yeah, like I enjoy the company of Slavs an awful lot. Like Eastern Europeans in general, I vastly prefer interacting with over Westerners. They tend to be much more blunt and much more like direct and down to earth and more interesting to speak to than like pampered Westerners. They will really irritate me. Anyway, where on earth were we? Yes. So we're still on page 51, and the next part of the puzzle is Baumeister asking the question, do perpetrators really regard themselves as victims, or are they simply pretending to do so? Magdalenus Rex, I love Slavic sense of humor and their aesthetics and worldview, but their victim complexes are insane. They really are. They truly, genuinely are. So to acknowledge this question, we have to also acknowledge the many benefits that victim status confers upon a person. Now, these are as follows. First, victims have a legitimate claim on the sympathy of others. Second, people and society as a whole generally feel strongly obligated to make restitution to victims, or at least stop them from enduring further harm. Now 3, perhaps most importantly, victims are justified in responding to provocation, i.e. by defending themselves. And as it says here, if you are the victim of another person's attack, you are allowed to defend yourself. Oh dear. I should really stop eating burgers before going on a stream. It seems that they are very, very conducive to making me belch while on stream, which is not something I should subject you poor people to. Now, those who are in the audience right now are probably going to be very familiar with modern trends And you're probably starting to narrow your eyes right about now, because Baumeister tackles this issue in the next paragraph. Now, first of all, he acknowledges that in recent history, conventional ideas of morality have been challenged by new, much more fair and humane beliefs that people guilty of various crimes are merely victims of urges that they cannot control. They shouldn't be blamed for their status. They should be understood, forgiven, and helped to do better in future. I'm just gonna let that hang in the air for a second, because you all know where this is going. You all know where this is going. We've been on this dance floor before. We've danced that mournful dance. The wording reminds me of the POCD thing Kirsche was on about earlier. God, don't even get me started on that absolutely spine-chilling shit that she was discussing. Ugh. Now, of course, these beliefs are just blatantly at odds with the natural self-interests of the average evildoer, and they even serve to incentivize that struggle to grasp hold of victimhood status. Now, in highlighting them, Baumeister is just cutting through decades worth of self-serving rhetoric and empty philosophizing, and I like it because he's neatly showcasing the core of the problem in terms that anyone can understand, and that's why I really do recommend this section in particular for anyone who wants to use it as a basis of an argument against concepts such as social justice and just progressive ideology in general, because you can't separate the idea that as a victim, you have a more privileged position than the perpetrator, and so it is completely logical for a perpetrator to want to assume the airs and graces of a victim. And we've seen that multiple times in this chapter already, that people, when they're discussing things as the perpetrator of an incident, are going to naturally downplay what they've done. And sorry, you hear the barking in the background. In as many cases as possible, they're going to try and instinctively, because again, this is instinctive. It is not something that most people are conscious of doing unless they have quite a high level of self-reflection. It is automatic, and this is something that Baumeister is trying to emphasize repeatedly. It is automatic and it is natural for someone who has committed a crime to seek out mentally circumstances that justify or downplay the actions that they've done. And it is automatic and natural for a victim to seek out reasons why what was done to them was completely unjust, was inexplicable, and is obviously the source of an act of pure evil, basically. Perpetrators try and downplay their actions, victims try and emphasize and exaggerate them. And this is a natural psychological tendency which you have to be able to acknowledge and work past in order to retain any level of objectivity in any of these cases. Now, this is all pretty heavy stuff, and it's getting a bit heavier. Now, we're into the final stretch here. There's only a couple of pages left, and this next section, Mutual Fault and Shared Blame, is probably the heaviest of them all. I'll just scroll down to it now. Now, of all the sections of this book that I've read so far, this next one is probably going to be the most polarizing overall, because it can directly... We've already confronted an awful lot of presumptions that are natural for people to have, but I think these next ones are confronting presumptions that I think even people in an audience like mine have probably internalized on a very deep level. So I especially don't like going into this because, again, my Kamiyoshi is Kirsche, who has endured several, not just one, but multiple abusive relationships and instances of violent men attacking her. But this section, I think, is really, really, really important. But it's pretty hard, okay? It's hard for me. And I'm sure other people will find it quite disagreeable in some cases because, well, it starts off pretty easily with just an illustration about a bar fight. And this is a pretty easy one. It's basically one man insults another who insults him in return. Then one shoves the other and he punches back. Finally, it escalates and one guy is lying on the ground with a knife through his gut. Now, the first assertion that Baumeister makes is pretty simple. He states that such interactions are the norm for violent instances rather than the exception. And on the next page, he quotes directly from a study by David Lukenbill, which says the majority of cases of criminal homicide involved reciprocal provocations in which mutual hostility escalated until one person killed the other. And it also includes these notes on the effect of bystanders, who often have a major role in egging public confrontations on. And if we think back to Chapter 1 for a moment, there was the incident where the American soldiers were involved in a shooting competition, except the target was an innocent tribal toddler of the village they had just finished exterminating. And it was kind of shocking to read their account, but they were framing their violence as just a shooting competition, so they were able to suppress that revulsion they would feel at the act of literally murdering a child. And then there was the public lynching of William Brown, who was the black man who was accused of raping a white woman, who was lynched by a group of several hundred people, and he was shot more than 1,000 times, and then his body was burned. And the collective posse together were able to collectively justify that extreme gratuitous violence they committed against him far more effectively than any one man of them could have done so. And so we see this repeatedly in group settings, that people feel justified based on the provocations, not just of the person they're engaging with, but also the crowd around them. And it even extends to things like internet arguments, where there's the whole playing to the crowd aspect, where if you even see it on places like TVA, is that people feel more justified in embracing controversial opinions if the stickers get on their side, and the people will rally with the people that seem to be getting the most positive reactions and so on. So again, this is pretty intensive and deep stuff, which I like, but it can be quite hard to read, and we're going to get into the harder to read part in a minute. We're still on the right page, 53. Now, evidence suggests that these instinctive acts of self-justification are sometimes so complete that even the perpetrators are not consciously aware of them. And it quotes here from a study done by Leonard Berkowitz on inmates imprisoned for violent assaults, which revealed that most of them didn't even believe they were the ones who attacked first. Now, Berkowitz himself admits that it's difficult to tell who was telling the truth in these instances, and this murkiness makes objective judgments of guilty and innocent parties even more difficult and harder than I think an awful lot of people would even like to admit. But here is the really shifty part of things, the part that I found quite hard to do research on. You have a sip. Baumeister really takes things up a notch here, because he shifts his attention away from violence between strangers, and he casts his eye back towards the intimate setting of the family. And he states right away that these exact same trends of reciprocal provocations still hold true. Now, he of course concedes that in a lot of cases, there are many men who engage in abusive behaviors unprovoked, or at least seemingly unprovoked. But he's sticking to his hypothesis here, and I actually went and looked up a couple of the studies that I've been perfectly happy to take most of the things that he cites here on at face value, but I actually did look up a couple of the studies that he cites here to see what kinds of things they were saying. Actually, let me just open this one here so I can reference the exact numbers. This is intimate partner violence, yes. So he says here, mutual aggression was the norm in cases of marital violence. In fully half the cases where any domestic violence was reported, so 50%, both spouses were violent. Moreover, even if only one spouse was violent, that person tended to believe that he or she was responding to some injustice by the other. Now, this extends to dating partners as well, because similar studies show that violence between high schoolers and college students who are in relationships is increasingly becoming the norm rather than the exception. Now, sorry, my throat's getting a bit rough because I've run out of water. Now, it's interesting that in this particular example, it's common for both parties to actually admit fault, where he says, about half the couples who experience any sort of violence tend to say that both parties were responsible for initiating it. Thus, if a girl slaps her date in the face, the couple may later agree that he had done something to provoke her, such as insult her. They don't just blame everything on her. Now, I looked up this study here, and I'll just read the conclusion. I'm not going to put it on screen, but this is the cumulative incidence of physical and sexual dating violence. Insights from a long-term, longitudinal study. And this was from 2023, September 20th. And the conclusion, the rates of perpetration and victimization. It says here, estimates from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey indicate that 36% and 34% of adult women and men, respectively, are victims of intimate partner sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking in their lifetime. And that's really fascinating because that's, again, 36% for adult women and 34% for adult men. So that's nearly identical numbers. Now, if you listen to the media and everything, it sounds as if it's almost exclusively men who are committing spousal violence against women. But these numbers actually paint a completely different picture. It's only about 2% more women that are experiencing spousal violence or violence during dating scenarios or relationships than men, which is really bloody scary, actually. Anyway, let me continue with this. Now, the next part goes back to just moving away from partner violence, although actually, no, it is actually partner violence, of course. But this actually involves murder, in that this is the O.J. Simpson case. To emphasize just how pervasive this narrative of victimhood could be, Baumeister next brings up the O.J. Simpson case. Here he notes that despite the extensive evidence of O.J. abusing his wife in the past, O.J. left a note behind at the scene of the crime claiming that he was the real victim. And I like how Baumeister phrases this very last sentence. One can only assume that he, O.J., felt he had been mistreated by her in some cruel fashion, which made his violence against her a retaliation rather than a spontaneous outburst. That's the last of my water. Now, while Baumeister does heavily stress that none of this excuses domestic abuse, he does remain adamant that it occurs most often in circumstances where both partners have engaged in mutually provocative behavior. In other words, if a marriage involves abuse, it was most probably the result of tensions between spouses that have escalated over time to the point one partner initiates violence against the other. While the media plays up cases of obviously sociopathic partners who gratuitously abuse the people they are with, the reality is that domestic abuse more often involves a tangled web of mutual misunderstandings, cruel remarks, power struggles, and resentment. And that's really one of the hardest parts of this book so far, because I think going back to the conversation I had earlier, or the example I had earlier about the husband and wife that I know who like constantly, or not constantly, but fairly frequently, it's happened probably 5 or 6 times over the course of like 10 years that I've known them. They have this disagreement over and over again, and I just think that and I live in a community where there is basically no domestic violence. My community, my church community especially, is full of very, I would say, upbuilding, positive, kind, loving people who are in very stable, long-term relationships, and yet even they have quite serious disputes on occasion. I think there was one example where a husband and wife couple, they didn't divorce, but they did split up and live in different houses for like 2 years of their life, and then they did get back together, and now they're completely stable and happy together again. But it was a long breakup period, and that they had quite serious problems. Oh no, why do you say oh no, Armored Glass Cannon? Zuli, I think Amber Heard is the exception to that from what we got for the court case. And yeah, but that is kind of the exception that proves the rule, because once again, Baumeister has emphasized many times that the court cases and the things that we get media showcases of tend to be the exception rather than the norm. Is that Amber Heard was obviously, and remember, Amber Heard was a very politicized case, because that was like the height of the Me Too movement, where the attitude was, oh, you must believe all women. It's obvious. And the media narrative from the start was, oh, Amber Heard is the victim. Amber Heard is the one who was abused. Johnny Depp is an evil, miserable, manipulative bastard. And he is entirely in the wrong, and when it goes to court and goes to trial, they're going to wring him dry, and we're going to see what a monster he actually is. And I remember people were very, very negative towards Johnny Depp for a long time. It was a very one-sided story. But then when the trial actually happened, then Amber Heard was revealed to be this very weird, bizarre, controlling, and really genuinely very sociopathic kind of person. The kind of stuff that she was doing at the trial was deeply creepy and like upsetting, and I didn't really want to watch much of it because of how worrying it really was. And again, I think that they were both kind of at fault for various rather toxic behaviors, but yeah, Amber Heard was very obviously someone who was pretty messed up. It was also live streamed by Nick Rakita too. Yes, the glorious cocaine man. And his swinging. Oh, guys, remember my dog stepped on a bee. Oh dear. Sorry, let me just look at something. Sorry, I just got pinged on Discord for a second. Sorry, I just had to reply to someone. The cocaine pope. The cocaine pauper at the moment, given, isn't his house being foreclosed, I think, which is just hilarious. Now then, yes, we're nearing the end here. There's just a couple more, not chapters, but there's just a couple more pages. And like quite thankfully, almost, where I've never been happier to go, oh great, we're back on the Jews again at the. Now there's a sentence that'll never be taken out of context. Mind you, I did call the Nazis like lovely people earlier in what I hope was transparently, obviously sarcasm. So yes, now that he is dug so deeply into the most intimate setting for violent behavior, like Baumeister's pulling things out again, and he's returning to the opening themes of the chapter, which is national violence and warfare. And yes, large-scale aggression often shows similar patterns of mutual escalating provocation. So far, he has weaved this narrative that these mutual provocations are present through basically all instances of violence, whether they are national, whether they are public, as in like a group or community of people, or if they are personal, even down to the most intimate of settings, like wives and husbands. And then I need to get So now he's going to bring things back around to the whole national level of things, with the story of the Masada fortress. Now, Masada was the great stand of the Jews at the fortress of Masada. And but first of all, he points out several of these things on the national scale. Is that he makes a few claims, and these can be summed up as the following. 1. The same pattern of mutually escalating provocations holds as true on the national scale as it does on the personal scale, which we've just discussed. 2. Neither side in a war views itself as the aggressor. I'm sure we both know how frequently that gets trotted out. 3. Groups like terrorists see themselves as fighting back against an unjust system, usually after they feel they have been denied more legitimate means of expression. And, as I mentioned earlier, to illustrate these points, Baumeister turns to one of history's favorite punching bags, the Jews. And here he discusses the great story of Masada, the last fortress of Jewish resistance against the Roman Empire. Now, first of all, he notes that in recent years, the trend has been to show the defense of Masada in an entirely positive light, and fictional depictions showcasing it as a heroic final stand against overwhelming numbers of imperial, evil, monstrous Roman soldiers, and kind of neglecting the fact that at the end of it, the Jews made a suicide pact. The men killed their wives and children and then began to kill one another and themselves, until the Roman assault in the morning met no resistance because all the Jews were already dead, although there were actually 5 survivors who I think hid in a cistern until everybody had gone, and then they were able to leave. So he says here, the truth is rarely so black and white. And let me scroll down a little bit again. Sorry about that. So after he's presented the facts of the siege, Baumeister kind of gets out and he analyzes the perspectives of both parties, and he starts with the Jews, as you always should, of course, with God's chosen people. And his perspective analysis of the Jews is simple, is that 1, they were a conquered people and they were fighting for their freedom. And 2, after a period of covert resistance, they had seized what they saw as their best chance for liberation. And 3, after a series of defeats, the Jews witnessed numerous massacres of their population, including the sacking of Jerusalem. And the secular historian Josephus writes at the time that something like between 300,000 to 1 million Jews were killed in the siege of Jerusalem alone, because basically the Jews evacuated all of the towns and cities in Judea. The ones that didn't flee to the mountains were the ones that congregated in Jerusalem, and they defended the city to basically their last breath, and they were massacred as a result. So it was a vast loss of life. But for the Roman side of the story, he considers these following factors. The first one was the Roman occupations rarely caused large-scale disruption to the local populations. Rome was generally one of the most tolerant imperialistic powers when it came to foreign relations, and especially religions. Basically, they didn't, even during the Roman occupation, the Jews were allowed to continue sacrificing in the temple, and the Jews were even able to persuade the Roman administrators not to put things to do things like put idols to the Roman emperors into the temple, and the Romans actually were willing to negotiate. And in fact, there's a funny story, because this is what I find fascinating, is that I read the Bible because I'm a Christian, and there's the example of Jesus entering the temple and throwing out the money changers, because the system the Jews had is that you were only allowed to buy special, because the Jews had this program of animal sacrifice in the temple that you had to do at certain times of the year. And as a result, the Jewish priests said that you can't use any animals for sacrifice except the ones that we provide you in the temple. But you can't buy these sacrifices unless you use specially issued temple currency. And when Jesus throws the money changers out of the temple, he's throwing out the men who take the regular Roman coinage and change it into Jewish coinage that the Jews then use to buy the sacrificial animals, which they charge vastly inflated exchange prices for. And it's very interesting that if you read the secular histories between the execution of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem, there is a small revolt in Judea, which is around the amount of money the Jewish priests, I remember these were Jewish priests, not Romans, the amount of money the Jewish priests were extorting from the people to be able to make sacrifices. And this is a case where the Roman administration actually steps in and tells the priests, you are not supposed to charge the people this much money. And the secular records say that they reduced the price of the temple sacrifices by 99%. So yeah, the imperialistic conquering Romans looked at what the Jewish priests were charging the Jews, which, remember, the Romans could also tax. And they said, guys, you are extorting these people to such an insane degree that we are going to lower the price you're allowed to charge these people to 1% of what you could previously. Which I think says an awful lot about the way the Jewish priests were acting prior to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Anyway, let's continue with the actual example. Jews and money. I wonder how many times I've heard that before. Yeah. We're getting some very we're getting some very mercantile content right now. Let us continue. Let us continue, guys. Let us continue. Let me just look back. I've tabbed out of my notes, which is very clever of me. Let me scroll down to... Now, to draw a whole conclusion from this ancient mess, Baumeister next calls attention to the works of historian Franklin Ford. And in Ford's opinion, while the Zealots themselves were likely to receive mercy from the Romans, were unlikely to receive mercy from the Romans, rather, it is unlikely the same brutal treatment awaited the non-combatants, such as women and children. Now, it was standard policy for the Romans to take non-combatants as domestic servants. So basically, if these women and children that the Jews slaughtered had been allowed to surrender, they would have become something like domestic servants or camp followers, or possibly slaves for Roman households. And, being a Roman slave wasn't as raw a deal as you might think. Like, slaves were still considered to have certain levels of rights, and were allowed to... have their own families and their own fairly reasonable situations, unless they were something like mining slaves, which really did have terrible lives. But those, you wouldn't have sent women and children to the mines. Like, it would have been healthy, grown adults that went to the mines or became galley slaves. Like, the Romans weren't stupid. They weren't trying to put women into the mines to dig out ore with their delicate lady hands or anything. So as Baumeister points out, one may dispute whether these reasons are sufficient to justify the violent response, aka the massacre, but it is rather clear that people who act violently often think that they are responding to an intolerable and often aggressive set of acts by someone else. I don't know, children crave the mines. I'm just trying to... There we go. So we's very nearly at the end. There's just another page or two to go. So in the final analysis, Baumeister reiterates once more that violence emerges from a pattern of antagonism shared by both parties. According to all the evidence that he's presented, it is clear that people who are violent act thusly because they feel they are responding to aggression from others, either real or perceived. And that leads us finally into this section, which is the very last one. Is no one to blame then? He points out right away, many of these conclusions are unfashionable, and I don't think I need to go into the whole social justice rhetoric or, modern ideas of, restorative justice, etc. But yeah, you can tell why this book pisses a lot of people off. Now, in his view, the questions are as follows. Should we blame the woman whose husband beats her simply because she criticized him beforehand? Are terrorists to be forgiven simply because they claim to have legitimate grievances? Should a knifing in a bar be dismissed as an unavoidable result of escalating provocations rather than an illegal and immoral taking of a human life? Aren't we committing the cardinal error of blaming the victim? Now, in his view, these questions are the result of a deeply rooted tendency for humans to confuse causation and responsibility. So rather than constantly look for black and white interpretations, it's more logical to assess a situation and assign blame to both the perpetrator and the victim if circumstances warrant it. He even goes so far as this is what he thinks should be done in the majority of cases. And I like this quote here that he makes. What is needed is a much broader sense that being victimized does not justify a violent response. We should be willing to blame both the victim and the perpetrator if necessary. In fact, in the majority of cases where aggression was mutual, we should blame both sides. And I overall do agree with him on this. And he gets into this here, which is also the case of this example here. A case of child abuse is discovered and the community is outraged. Then the lawyer demonstrates that the abuser was herself abused as a child, and the social scientists confirm that being a victim of abuse is a significant cause of becoming abusive oneself. She shouldn't be blamed for what she did to her little girls, because her father was the truly evil one. Sympathy is garnered, and the defendant is given a lighter sentence or even acquitted. And I like that he dares to say that it's a woman in this case, because we all know that if you're a woman and you commit an act of child abuse, you're almost certain to get a lighter sentence than if you were a man. It's a very, very well-known case in America's legal system that women get lighter sentences for the same crimes than men do. It's very common, and it's really disgusting. And he points out that a more appropriate response would be to pity the abuser for what she suffered during her own childhood, but to condemn her own abusive actions regardless. Which, of course, I agree with too. Because right now in society you have this dreadful situation where it's almost as if blame and victimhood are matter and antimatter, and when they meet they engage in a process of mutual annihilation. So if you think of a modern court case as two sides, the defender and the accuser. The defender is trying to build a case of victimhood, and the prosecutor is trying to build a case of blame or accountability. And when those two forces meet, they mutually annihilate each other. But the thing is, they annihilate on a one-to-one level. So the winner is the one who can establish a higher level of victimhood or blame that is left over after all of the arguments have been made. And the problem is that because this attitude of mutual annihilation exists, it means that it's just like in this case here about the case of child abuse, that if it can be somehow proven that the woman is more of a victim than her own children, then it stands to reason that, oh, the woman should be pitied and given a light sentence. It doesn't matter the pain of the children because the woman was suffered more. So it wouldn't be fair to punish her more because she's already suffered. It's like I say, it's a one-to-one annihilation. And frankly, I think that people who engage with it should be annihilated. American legal system is a joke, I do agree. And this final illustration that he gives is one that I remember reading about in the news myself, which is pretty interesting. During the years Baumeister spent working on this book, the most dramatic news event involved the marital catastrophe of John and Lorena Bobbitt. The couple came to national attention when Lorena was arrested for cutting off her husband's penis with a kitchen knife while he lay in bed one night. She admitted that she did mutilate him in this way, but she accused him of having mistreated and raped her on multiple occasions, which he denied. He too was indicted, and both cases went to trial. Now, this example is very useful because Baumeister points out there's only 4 logical possible conclusions. That the man was the guilty party, that the female was the guilty party, that both were guilty, or that neither was guilty. And this was a great big thing that went on through the media for a very long time. And at the end of it, both of them, both John and Lorena, were acquitted of all crimes. Apparently, neither of them had done anything wrong. Magdalenus Rex, I listened to a documentary about Lorena Bobbitt, and frankly, she was totally the victim. John was a massive sociopath after the divorce, and he went through 3 more postal abuse episodes after it. That's entirely, oh, sorry, I've got a horrible piece of skin hanging off the edge of my lip. Divo Leon, I do understand where he is getting at, I do understand where he is getting at, and I almost agree with him, but it's a very utopic argument. Most humans do not want neutrality on these topics. I would agree with you. I think that he's making these arguments not to say this is how everything should be. Obviously, he thinks it should be, but he's trying to get people to think more than he's trying to insist that this is how things should be done, and I do appreciate this. He does acknowledge many times that this isn't really the ideal thing, that there are edge cases, there are always going to be biases, but he's trying to create a framework of objective analysis that you can use no matter what the circumstances and no matter what the biases or circumstances might be, which I do agree with. Because as he says here, the one conclusion that was never considered was that both of them had committed crimes and should have been found guilty. Quite possibly John had abused his wife, and if so, he ought to have been punished to the full extent of the law. Still, whatever he did, it was not acceptable to go to the kitchen, return with a knife, and, cut off his bobbit worm, as we say. Whatever her grudge against him was, it was hard to regard her actions as legal. And he makes a good point here, is that the natural tendency of people to see good guys and bad guys, or bad guys and innocent victims, makes it very hard for people to acknowledge the common reality of both sides having culpability to some degree. He's not saying that both sides are equally culpable, but that it's often not a black and white case. As he points out below, is that it's clear that the cause of controlling domestic violence in the United States would be much better served by a pair of convictions than by a pair of acquittals. And police are often very reluctant to intervene in any of these cases. And I remember watching a video just a few days ago on YouTube about a guy who recently got a divorce. And he was saying that when he went to counseling, he was suggested to go to counseling, and all the counseling did was tell him that he was no longer in love and that he wasn't able, and all of the things that he was told to do involved, there was no... He stated, now this could have been him spinning things, but I do believe him based on other instances that I have heard, is that he said, it was all on me to fix the relationship. The only thing that happened in that room was that I sat in a chair, and my wife and my therapist both took turns telling me all the things that I did wrong, that I had done wrong, and needed to account for. And from my view, I had done everything that I could to make this marriage work for many years. And it was this counseling session that finally convinced me that I had no other option, I had no other reasonable course in life than to end this marriage and break up with my wife and give up half my possessions, simply to sever this thread and move on before it destroyed me. And a lot of other people have said similar things, in that the whole system of marital therapy in the United States and another place assumes that one party or the other is the primary problem, and that all of the healing has to come from them. Whereas the reality is that that's not the case. Indeed, I've watched divorce lawyers and even like very, very anti-divorce people. It's funny that people often assume that people that are anti-divorce are like, you must stay with your partner no matter what, even if he's beating you, even if he's being abusive, you've got to stay with him because marriage is sacred. But I found that people that are anti-divorce tend to be the ones that actually have the attitude of, look, you really need to acquire mutual understanding with your spouse. You have to see things with as much empathy as possible, even if you don't like having to do so. You have to see where fault lies on both sides, and you have to work together, because you don't have the option to simply walk away from each other, that you tied a cord that cannot be undone. So you have to pull out all the stops and work together, not against each other. Which is an approach that I do strongly agree with. I think this attitude of cases where, abuse, violence, etc. are automatically assumed to be absolutely 100% the fault of whoever threw the first punch or whatever, it's not productive. Now, I want to say that it may bring justice. If somebody hits their wife or even hits their girlfriend, I think that person should be punished, okay? I'm not saying that they shouldn't be punished. However, is covenant for that binary relationship. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sav. Also, hello, Sav. I don't think I've seen you chat before, but yeah, that's a very good word. You've made a covenant. You have made a covenant. But yeah, as I was saying, if someone hits their partner, that person should be punished. But at the same time, I think that saying that person is 100% absolutely at fault and is the only one that should do anything to fix things is the wrong way to approach things. Hey, been a few times, so no worries. That's fine. I'm very forgetful. If you've been around before, I apologize for forgetting you. But yeah, that's my take on that whole thing. Let me just scroll down again. Oh yeah, that's the end of it, actually. I forgot that's the end of my notes, too. He does end chapters fairly abruptly. So yeah, in my conclusion, that is the second chapter, and I really hope that people got a lot out of it, because it was a very fascinating chapter for me to read through. And I like the way that Baumeister goes back over the same thing in a lot of depth, because in this chapter he approaches violence and evil from multiple different scales. His first time was the kind of mass genocide, the mass violence angle. Then he went to the more personal side of things with abusive relationships, and then he pulled things back out again and looked more to public venue of violence between, say, bar brawls or riots or gang violence, and then he pushed the scope back in again so you could really see how all of these different threads and all of these justifications and mutual provocations tie into a very intimate setting like partner-on-partner violence. And after that, he brings it back out again to highlight how this involves things like national provocation as well. The same themes play out no matter what scale things occur at. And then, of course, he gives his final conclusion that he feels that for an empirical analysis of things, you have to be willing to look at all sides, and you have to acknowledge that, for one thing, the narrative of the victim is always going to be skewed. But at the same time, you can't compensate for that by going to the perpetrator and taking their word for it. You have to balance your analysis so that you are taking into account the perspective of both the victim and the perpetrator. And you have to acknowledge fundamental facts. And those fundamental facts are that a perpetrator is automatically and instinctively going to find justifications and reasons to downplay their criminal activities, their evil, their violence, etc. Meanwhile, the victim is more likely to look at what has been done to them and exacerbate that in their mind. They are going to play it out in their mind. They are probably going to magnify it in their mind as well. And it is going to be their instinct to try and find reasons why what was done to them was not their fault in any way, and the way they have been treated is unprecedented and unreasonable. In other words, they're going to demonize the perpetrator in their mind, which is a perfectly understandable thing to do, especially if they are the victim of something like rape or abuse or other extreme behaviors, which is completely understandable, and victims should get sympathy for that kind of thing. But it should also not prevent us from understanding that their perspective is skewed, and that to gain a proper understanding of a situation, both sides need to be equally assessed, with their own nuances acknowledged and their own preconceptions properly factored into the final analysis. And I just realized that we're nearly at 3 hours. I intended this to only be 2 hours long, so I'm actually very happy that we ran so much over time, because it really kind of shows how much meat there was to this chapter, and I am going to start reading the next chapter tomorrow, so hopefully by next Monday we'll be able to have at least another 2 or 3 hour stream about the chapter 3, which I'll just... There needs to be an immense level of emotional intelligence to be able to do this, especially nowadays. I do agree with you, Divo Leon. It definitely does. And that's another thing that I think is worthy of consideration. I feel that the current social environment, especially if people are very mainstream in terms of their consumption of, say, media and so on, promotes a sense of emotional burnout in people. People are driven towards automatic assumptions of guilt or innocence based on that burnout, because they have been so pressurized and so stressed by the life they have led that they don't have the energy left over to engage their emotional intelligence and carefully analyze these situations. And another major problem is that a lot of psychologists, a lot of doctors, a lot of policemen, a lot of people that are involved in cases like we have just been discussing this entire chapter, experience a lot of emotional burnout themselves. They find it very difficult to stay on track and to remain objective and empathetic, because once you've heard hundreds of testimonies of victims and you've seen dozens and dozens of crimes, it's like emotional scar tissue. So I am very conscious and aware of these factors, and I think that one of the major reasons I am able to remain as objective as I am is basically because I have lived a very good life. I have had a very low level of exposure to trauma and a very low level of exposure to misery in my life. And so I view that as an advantage, because it has allowed me to remain fairly empathetic and fairly open to this level of analysis. But I completely understand why somebody in a difficult situation who has been battered around by this world can want very much to just view things through a lens of black and white. And I can't condemn those people. I really can't. I think it is suboptimal that they do so, but I can understand why they do it completely. And I don't blame them for that. But anyway, my throat is now hurting. I need some more water. Actually, I need some more coffee. I also need to go to the bathroom. And again, I'm finished with my notes, so I'm going to go indoors now. I'm going to end stream, and I'm going to go get some rest for college tomorrow. I'm very grateful for everybody that has come to this stream. I really do appreciate everybody here, and I really hope that everybody has a nice night. Hopefully numbers will be even bigger next time. I'm glad everybody has enjoyed this, and please, it really does help if anybody knows anybody else that would benefit from these kind of analyses, by all means, share this video. And if anybody also, I just want to make it clear, if anybody would like a PDF of this book that I'm reading for their own reference, just drop me a DM on either TVA or Discord, and I will be more than happy to share it with you, because again, knowledge wants to be free. Knowledge wants to be free. Good night, everybody. Thank you very much for your time. I will see you next week at the same time.